Great. Okay. I'd like to call the March 11th, 2026 meeting of the Open Space Board of Trustees to order. And we'll take a roll call, starting on my far left. Brady?
Here.
Michelle?
Here.
John?
Present.
Sarah?
Here.
And Harmon, I'm here. So we have a quorum. Everybody's here. And the next item, I guess are we going to handle the rules of decorum right now? That's, okay, yeah. Do you need to, you want 5 minutes? Okay, I'll do the minutes and then go ahead and do your thing. All right. So we'll just jump to the approval of the minutes. I know, Brady, you had something on page 3 and you emailed about that a minute ago. Just so thank you very much, so that Leah would have what you wanted to say all written down. That was great. But let's start with page 1. Does anybody have any issues with page 1 of the minutes? Okay. Page 2. Okay. Page 3, Brady.
Yeah, so there's a paragraph kind of summarizing a few of my comments. The very last sentence asked to strike that sentence that starts with, he suggested an adjustment to base and to be replaced with, he expressed interest in exploring a biennial 2-year budget cycle to increase staff efficiency and provide more time for work planning, noting that such a system would still allow for midstream adjustments to base when necessary.
Okay. And is that basically what you had said in the actual meeting?
It is actually, I did go back and check the YouTube, and it wasn't just in my idealized memory. That is, in fact, what I said.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Does anybody have any issues with Brady's proposed change? Okay. Any other issues with page 3? Okay, so I'll take a motion for approval of the, let's see, what was the date of that meeting? The February 11th minutes with the amendment.
So moved.
Get a second?
Second.
Okay, so we've got a motion by Estrella and a second by Robinson to approve the February 11th minutes with the change that was spoken into the record and also emailed to you, Leah. All in favor, say aye.
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 Okay, you got a unanimous vote on that, 5-0, to approve the minutes. All right, so now before we get to public comment, I will turn it over to staff for the rules of decorum.
Thank you. Okay, just on a bit of a, there we go. The city has engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. This vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and OSBT, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. For more information about this vision and the community engagement processes, please visit this link. The city will enforce the rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code, including participants are required to sign up to speak using the name they are commonly known by, and individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. Currently, only audio testimony is permitted online. No attendee shall disrupt, disturb, or otherwise impede the orderly conduct of any city meeting in a manner that obstructs the business of the meeting. This also includes failing to obey any lawful order of the presiding officer to leave the meeting room or refrain from addressing the board. Only one person at a time at the podium unless an accommodation like an interpreter is required. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No standing in or otherwise blocking the aisles in violation of fire code or in any way that obstructs the vision or audio of other audience members. No signs or flags shall be permitted in city council chambers, except for one sign held by a person with the sign measuring no more than 11 by 17 inches, which is held no higher than the person's face. No participant shall make threats or use forms of intimidation against any person. We ask that you not affix items to the podium or dais or walls or other surfaces of the chamber. Signs, flags, or other items used to communicate must be held by one person when displayed. Obscenity, other epithets based on race, gender, or religion, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the meeting will not be tolerated. In-person participants are asked to refrain from expressing support or disagreement verbally or with sounds such as applause or snapping, with the exception of declarations. Traditionally, support is shown through American Sign Language applause or jazz hands. If you're joining in person and would like to speak during public comment or items identified for public hearing, please sign up at the table and we'll call you up to speak at the podium. If you're joining online, you can raise your hand to speak during public comment or items identified for public hearing. You can do that using the raise hand icon or by clicking the participants icon, then the three dots on the bottom right, and select raise hand. We don't have anyone joining by phone right now, so I'll read those instructions if we do. Okay.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, so on tonight's agenda, we have 3 matters from the Department of Directors update and 1 written information item, but no public hearings. So if there's anyone who wants to make public comment, this will be your only chance to make public comment tonight. So we invite your public comment. And you might want to know tonight is the last meeting for Michelle Estrella after 5 years of service. So gratitude is welcome if that's what you feel.
Okay, so starting, we have Emily Reynolds, followed by Alan Delamere, and then Elizabeth Black. So Emily Reynolds, if you're here, you can come up to the podium. And I see Emily joining online. Thank you. Emily, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Good evening. Emily Reynolds, resident of Boulder for 50 years now. Thank you for this opportunity to address your board. I wanted to speak this evening about a topic which has recently been changed from this evening's agenda to future month's meetings, the paramount importance of retaining Boulder's open space. The public hears that there is a move under discussion by this board to sell off open space. In the face of rampant, hideous development all over town, I do question whether the southern entry corridor to Boulder should be changed from what was formerly so very important to the Open Space Board, a natural, scenic, welcoming entrance to the city, to more development after a sale of our precious open space. Would this not set an extremely negative precedent for disposing of small edge pieces of OSMP land throughout the system? Would this sale not represent a betrayal to the people who have worked and paid to preserve our open spaces for decades? Is open space not a significant factor in what distinguishes Boulder from other cities that have not been able to stop the endless sprawl of developers? I also understand that there is quite a significant need for agricultural workers to maintain the open space properties of Hodges, as well as Shanahan Ranch, Rolling Rock Ranch, and South Boulder Creek Trail. Since Historic Boulder has acknowledged that the red sandstone house on the Hodges property is suitable for historic designation, wouldn't this be an important way to help house the much-needed ag workers? Would it not be quite preliminary to discuss a sell-off of the land before historic designation can occur? This idea to sell off open space seems ill-conceived and unworthy of the Open Space Board of Trustees. We have entrusted you with the preservation of open space, not the sale and disposal of open space. Thank you.
Next, we have Alan Delamere, followed by Elizabeth Black, and then Ed Youngs. And Alan is online. Alan, you should be able to unmute yourself now. Alan, I can see you've unmuted yourself. Are you able to say something? Okay. Maybe one more time? Okay, we're unable to hear you right now, so I will come back to you and we'll chat on Zoom. Next, we have Elizabeth Black, followed by, and then I'll come back to Alan Delamere.
Hi, Elizabeth Black, 4340 North 13th Street. Yesterday, I sent you our proposed changes to the draft comp plan. Please encourage staff to support these changes when they work on the final draft. There are several principles which guide our proposed changes. First, we believe that your irrigation water and water rights are incredibly valuable and should be upgraded, well-maintained, safeguarded, and celebrated in the comp plan. Our championship and edits of policy number 94, policy number 41, and the future food systems insert all support this principle. Secondly, we believe that the linchpin of a healthy local food system is healthy, prosperous farmers and ranchers. If local farmers and ranchers are not able to make a decent living from their hard work, then there will be no more local food. And to make a decent living, producers must be able to sell their food. This is why we ask for the addition of farmers markets and retail outlets to policy number 93 and the future of food system inserts in the plan. The same principle, the necessity of healthy, prosperous farmers and ranchers for a healthy local food system, is why we are proposing the addition of practices that increase yield and economic viability to the other sustainable and regenerative practices in policy number 95. The most overlooked necessity in a sustainable and regenerative food system is the farmers and ranchers who is able to stay in business and prosper. Without economically viable farmers and ranchers, the entire local food system crashes. Without prospering lessees, you could not manage your 16,000 acres of ag land. Please recognize this reality and include practices that increase yield and economic viability in policy number 95. We also believe that producing food is not just an 8 to 5 job, but rather a 24/7 vocation. Animals and irrigation water need attention at all hours of the day. Fences fail and livestock can wander onto roads at any time. Erratic weather and seasonal deadlines cause farm work schedules to expand. Ag workers living on the land they manage can deal with all this. This is why ag worker housing on leased ag lands is a priority for OSMP lessees and must be developed despite the limitations of your charter. Please include the goal of more ag worker housing on OSMP ag lands in policy number 96. We believe that these edits will bring the comp plan in line with the needs and priorities of our agricultural community and local food production. Thank you.
Next, we'll go back to Alan Delamere, followed by Ed Youngs, and then George Gersel. Alan, you should be able to unmute yourself. Alan, I can see you've unmuted yourself. Are you able to say something? Okay, we may come back to you one more time and then I'll chat with you. Okay, next we have Ed Youngs, followed by George Gersel.
Good evening. My name is Ed Youngs. Thank you for the opportunity this evening to speak on the citywide multimodal strategic plan 7C. Like many others in Boulder, it's been my good fortune to have lived here for more than 30 years and hiked many of the open space trails, more than 10,000 times actually, with my late dog Saki, though recently less ambitiously with my wife and friends. Like you, we've all witnessed many changes in Boulder proper and the open space environment. Thankfully, some for the better, but a few not so good. Among those not so good is the increase in bike traffic on some of the trails that are most convenient to where we live, and the reason I'm here tonight. Among the changes proposed in the strategic plan is granting bike access to an additional approximately 4 miles of foot trails in the Shanahan Ranch area. Even though we don't frequently hike those trails, we can easily empathize and actually sympathize with those in hikers who do use those trails. In the areas we do hike, more trail bikes, especially e-bikes in more recent years, have changed our experience significantly. We used to spend our time leisurely watching for birds, bees, and beasts. Now it's become watch out for the bikes. There are fewer animals, but we must be continuously alert for cyclists who may startle from behind, often approaching at speed even without signaling. I suspect some of you can relate to such experiences that cancel out part of the enjoyment and pleasures of motivating your original reason to be out there walking. My bottom line is that we should be very reluctant to open additional trails to bikes, and not only to preserve the wildlife, as many have argued, and I myself have argued, but also to preserve the benefits that some call bathing in nature for us pedestrians. Thank you.
Next, we have George Gersel, followed by Lynn Siegel, and then Carl Ford.
Thank you. I'm George Gerstel, speaking for Plan Boulder County. Plan Boulder encourages OSMP to maintain ownership of the Hodges property on Marshall Road and continue making it available for agricultural and land steward housing for the following reasons. Consistency with BVCP Policy 23, Rural Land Preservation, which states the city and county support preservation of rural land uses and character in Boulder Valley when environmentally sensitive areas, hazard areas, agriculturally significant lands, vistas, significant historic resources, and established residential areas exist. Also, consistency with Boulder Valley Comp Plan Policy 97, the city and county support exploring options to increase housing opportunities for agricultural workers and land stewards in the Boulder Valley. Further, this property was acquired in 2007 to maintain the scenic vista at the entrance to Boulder. The need exists more than ever to protect this wonderful view at the entrance to the Boulder and South Boulder Creek viewshed. Finally, this property is largely in the floodplain for South Boulder Creek and experienced significant flooding during previous flood events. Encouraging perhaps a large house to be built in this area would be inconsistent with that goal. We encourage OSMP to comply with the current policy direction in the comprehensive plan, maintain ownership of the property, and continue to use the existing historic housing for worker housing and ensure that the existing floodplain is maintained and protected. Thank you for your consideration.
Next is Lynn Siegel, followed by Carl Ford, and then Linda Parks. Lynn Siegel, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yeah, it took a moment. Yeah, now we got Boulder Valley Comp Plan. I guess that's what you're discussing tonight. And, you know, Area 3 was supposed to be for emergencies, for solar or for ag. There's so much development going on that like I just saw one tonight on Design Advisory Board, 28th and J, uh, uh, utilizing every square inch of the property. It's like this is sprawl, spread out, and this relates to open space directly because these communities where they give you a little front lawn that's maybe 2 feet deep, you know, that's not open space. People want to get out of these developments, these little cluster cities. That's what this one is, like Weather Vane out on Arapaho and 57th or something. You get more and more dense developments, enclosed little communities. They're like walled off communities, one after the other. Where every unit has garage. That's a transportation issue, right? Gridlock, you know? And what about Sundance? More bodies. The Boulder Valley Comp Plan should have a metric that you have established for how much population can be here before any of these developments are done. And it's incumbent upon you, in the interest of public spaces, to promote that, to push for it. Because you've got a huge deficit on maintenance and operations and need to buy more land, not sell off like at the Hodge property and the little red house or whatever it is. That shouldn't be done. I agree with Emily too. How come every single person that comes up speaks to you? Very seldomly is there much discussion afterwards in any of these boards or the city council as to what they're doing, and the public is stuck with it. And I see it because I follow a lot of boards, and the planning board is the worst. And more development is not good for this community, and it's not good for open space. And you should have a metric that requires population to be covered for open space impact fees for every person in this community that's added on.
Next is Carl Ford, followed by Linda Parks, and then Hans Bucher. Carl, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thanks. So on behalf of my family, I appreciate the opportunity to speak about the 7C multimodal assessment. I'm a trip leader for several organizations, and I've hiked at least 1,000 miles on OSMP lands over the years. I come for the world-class hiking and scenery. I'm really concerned about hiker-biker conflict on these trails, especially with teenage athletes training and going fast. Past experience with mountain bikers shows aggressive riding, not yielding, near collisions, actual collisions with injuries. And there'll be wider trails and more use. I also think there'll be loss of solitude, peace, impact to wildlife with the fast vehicles and noisy groups. Weeds are already a problem, and heavier use with mountain bikes will exacerbate the problem and fragment habitat. The Colorado Natural Heritage Program rated South Boulder and Shanahan grasslands as very high biodiversity significance, and it has rare plants and butterflies. Also, that area, the South Boulder grasslands, are designated as the Colorado Tallgrass Prairie Natural Area, or high quality natural features of statewide significance. And double emphasis here, exemplary management to conserve that feature. So the Natural Heritage Program believes that OSMP will continue to protect that. Thank you.
Next is Linda Parks, followed by Hans Bucher, and then Hazel Gordon. Linda, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight and your time. I'm here to discuss the current stop of the prairie dog mitigation at Boulder Valley Ranch. It's come to our attention that it was halted for pupping season, which I believe is against what City Council had recommended, that we should continue working on the mitigation on the lands that we started. In the last 2 years, perk mitigation has been working to remove the populations there. It has made an enormous difference. Many of us who board horses there, and Bob Lover, who runs the land management, we're all thrilled to begin to see the pastures responding, mainly with weeds, but grasses were trying. Wherever the prairie dogs had been removed, the soil had seemed to stay in place. And wherever the prairie dogs had not yet been removed, we are seeing devastating losses. I did email this note with some images for you to reference when you have a chance. This process has been slow to mitigate. And this interruption now of allowing the perk to continue is interfering with the mitigation and the removal, and it also will interfere with the irrigation season as it comes close in April, May, June sometime. We and you have a responsibility to restore as much as we can. It is difficult to say, but prairie dog extermination is the only choice remaining. I am just not sure what our current wildlife biologists are really doing. OSMP has invested a large sum of money to remove the prairie dogs. If the work does not continue, they will return to the areas that have been cleared. This is wasting money, time, and effort for so many of us involved in this. The Lover family has been struggling for years to manage that ranch, and they know every inch of it. It was a losing battle until 2 years ago when we saw the hope of management by open space to allow us to continue the mitigation. This ranch is an absolute gem. Just think, 3 miles from the edge of town, there's a working ranch with calves bouncing about in the pastures, haying, horses grazing, and trails so much appreciated by the public. It would be a terrible shame to see it be reduced to the desert it's becoming today. We urge decision makers to allow uninterrupted mitigation efforts to continue at the ranch so we can continue to preserve the land, prevent reinfestation, and save the resources and maintain progress in this area. This letter is from both Helen Brader and myself. Thank you so much for your time.
Next is Hans Bucher, followed by Hazel Gordon, and then Suzanne Bott. Hans, if you're attending in person, you can come up to the podium now. Okay. Next is Hazel Gordon, followed by Suzanne Bott.
I'm Hazel Gordon. I live in Boulder County and appreciate the opportunity to speak today about the natural environment we cherish here in Boulder and urge the trustees to consider the environmental impacts on our western trails that will be caused by introducing mountain bikes here in their quest to find more convenient access for Fairview High School bikers. Mountain bikers and staff will undoubtedly enlarge and modify the existing trail systems south of Shanahan Ridge, both by riding these trails and the use of trail building tools such as a mechanical excavator, and rock movers in this area. and will disrupt the current trail ecosystems and the less visible environmental niches. On the Greenbrier Connector and lower Big Blue Stem trails, the iNaturalist observers have documented on their website a variety of insects, such as 8 types of butterflies, 6 types of beetles, and so on. These groups have larvae that do not fly and rely on the stability of soil burials for protection in their growth sequences. The same trails also have photographs of mainly insectivorous birds, such as western meadowlarks, western bluebirds, and Say's phoebe, which depend on these arthropods for their survival. On the other hand, many of these insects are necessary to pollute the flowers that other birds rely on for their main food sources. These include those seen in our naturalist photographs, such as the Vesper sparrow and goldfinches on or close to those trails I mentioned. Additionally, some 100 to 200 bird species recently have been sighted in the general area that encompasses the very popular South Mesa Hiking and Birding Trail, according to eBird website notations. Considering the basis of the food chain, plants that have been identified by our naturalist photographers for feeding of resident or migrating animals include nectar, pollen, fruits, seeds, and so on. So the documentation, we have prickly pears, raspberries, and it's so on in these areas. Rather than considering the short-term goals of a small group of biking recreationalists who number less than 2,000 members in their organization, I hope that the Board of Trustees is making decisions about trails in the state tallgrass natural area and will evaluate and choose to sustain the tens of thousands of arthropods, birds, and other creatures that make up our thriving Boulder open space systems. Since 94% of respondents to a recent survey indicate that ecosystem health and resilience are very important to this open space, it is important to save what the taxpayers who fund our system want. Thank you for listening.
Next is Suzanne Bott, followed by Bev Baker, and then Paula Schuler.
Good evening. My name is Suzanne Bott, and I would like to speak on the multimodal assessment. I live in South Boulder, and I hike and birdwatch on the Shanahan and Big Blue Stem trails multiple times per week. And I share that trail with the many, many, many other hikers, runners, dog walkers, families, bird watchers who also enjoy recreating on those South Boulder trails. I suspect that's one of the most popular trail systems in the city. Unfortunately, I am no longer going to feel safe using those trails that I love and that I chose to live next to if bikes are allowed on those trails. There is absolutely no question that bikers deserve and need safety to access the bike trails on the south side of the city. That's not a question. But compromising the experience of all of the other groups who use those trails is really not an acceptable solution. The 2011 West Trail Area Plan, which was developed over a very long period of time with staff and many citizens, recommended that the city work with CDOT and with Boulder County Transportation Department to provide safe access for cyclists to those South Boulder bike trails through improvements to the Highway 93 and 170 intersection, as opposed to creating multi-use trails in order to, in their words, quote, eliminate visitor conflict associated with multi-use trails, end quote. That conflict is really real, it's very real, and it would very likely discourage large numbers of other types of users from from recreating on those trails that they now enjoy. So I ask you to please find a workable solution that meets the safety and the recreational needs of all groups in our community, so that we can all continue to enjoy our beautiful open space. Thank you so much.
Next is Bev Baker, followed by Paula Schuler and Tom Burkle.
Good evening, trustees. I'm Bev Baker. I'm speaking for the Conservation Committee of the Boulder County Audubon Society about OSMP's multimodal assessment project. A lot of great details have been covered this evening. My comments are pretty general. Our primary concerns are that as the project moves forward, that staff and the board will give a high priority to 1, protecting wildlife and ecosystems, including the Tallgrass Prairie State Natural Area, and 2, protecting the safety of pedestrian visitors and preserving places for them to enjoy quiet activities such as hiking and observing nature. As an example, on a recent hike in the area, my companions and I were treated to a chance to quietly observe a migrating spring flock of mountain bluebirds, bluer than the bluebird sky that day, and a coyote hunting prairie dogs. We appreciate staff's written update for this meeting and look forward to the upcoming public engagement opportunities. Thank you.
Next is Paula Schuler, followed by Tom Burkle.
Hi, I'm Paula Schuler. I live in unincorporated Boulder County. I want to talk to you about the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan draft, specifically page 65, titled Agriculture in the Boulder Valley, which describes 16,000 acres of working lands, 30 acres of diversified vegetables, and an additional 250 acres that have the soil and water conditions to grow vegetables. The narrative goes on to say that most of the city's agricultural land is dry land pasture and does not have sufficient water to grow vegetables. As a farmer in Boulder County for over 35 years on both private irrigated land and irrigated OSMP land, I don't believe this narrative accurately describes agriculture on OSMP lands. OSMP has 6,000 acres of irrigated land, basically 1/3 of their total 16,000 acres of working lands. These 6,000 acres provide much more than 30 acres of vegetables. These lands grow food in the form of hay, or feed in the form of hay, foraging for grazing, and also produce food. Beef, pork, lamb, chicken, as well as raw milk shares and honey, for example, come from those irrigated OSMP lands and are available for sale at either the farmer's market, through CSAs, or at a local farm. Additionally, tenants of OSMP, such as myself, produce hay on our leased irrigated OSMP parcel, and that hay is sold to other local beef producers for feed, as well as back to OSMP for their restoration and regenerative land practices. I think that we are part of a full circle that truly benefits the local community. Our farm, as well as many farms and ranches that lease OSMP land, are in some way part of the food system or produce other products that benefit the local community. In addition, the majority of these 6,000 irrigated acres are diverse perennial pastures with no disturbance. These irrigated lands provide an incredible opportunity for increased soil health, resilience, and carbon sequestration, and absolutely contribute to helping Boulder meet their climate goals, another area besides agriculture that is very important to the citizens of Boulder Valley. My point being, saying that OSMP has 30 acres of lettuce, peppers, and tomatoes, and another 250 acres that can grow vegetables does not describe agriculture in the Boulder Valley. I find the current narrative in the draft very perplexing. There are many good things going on besides managed dry land grazing and growing veggies. By the way, there's actually food, wheat, being grown on dry land pastures too. The current draft narrative provides a very narrow view and does not paint a complete picture of the many benefits of agriculture in the Boulder Valley. The new comp plan will be in place for decades. If there's to be a page dedicated to agriculture in the Boulder Valley, the narrative under that heading needs to be corrected, deserves a serious edit to more accurately and realistic describe what happens on irrigated and dry land working lands managed by OSMP. I hope you agree. Thank you.
Next is Tom Burkle.
I'm here to urge you to not move forward with the disposal of the Hodges property. The goal of this disposal, according to the staff memo, is in service to the residential facilities use analysis. The residential facilities update memo from 7/9/2025 identifies 41 properties with residential improvements. In the memo, they were divided among 3 categories: relocate or deconstruct, potential programmatic use, or continued current programmatic use. Hodges was placed in the continued current programmatic use category, a category that is shared with 23 of the 41 properties. In this evaluation, Hodges was rated in good condition with moderate resource value. On its face, the continue category would seem to be the least likely to receive a recommendation of disposal. So to bring forward Hodges for disposal 7 months later would seem to be more of an ad hoc decision than relying upon the RFUA framework. A vote to dispose of Hodges suggests that virtually all of the properties identified in the 7/9 memo could be disposed of without regard to the systematic evaluation of the RFUA. The closing of the 7/9 memo was clear. In the coming months, OSMP will begin to consider the disposal of remaining properties for which a programmatic use is not identified. But the larger question, beyond the apparent lapses in following the process that OSMP itself created, is the matter of disposal. There are better options than divesting of the property. 1, hire a residential property manager to maintain and administer the lease. 2, repurpose for agricultural tenant housing. Or 3, deconstruct the residence and retain the open space. All of these choices are preferable to disposing of the property and facing the uncertainty associated with private ownership. Please do not move forward with this disposal. Thank you.
Next, we'll come back to Alan Delamere and Hans Bucher. Alan, if you could try to unmute yourself now. And we can still see you've unmuted yourself, but can't hear you. If you could try one more time to say something. Okay. We're still unable to hear you.
Sam, if Alan can't get through for some reason, Alan, if you can hear us and you still can't speak to us, please feel free to put your comments in an email to OSBT and we'll pay special attention to it as if you had spoken at this meeting.
Okay, and Hans Bucher. Okay. And we'll move on to hands raised online. Vinay Shah, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm Vinay Shah. I'm the former president and current vice president of the Rocky Mountain Hang Gliding and Paragliding Association and the site director for paragliding in Boulder. Since we last discussed paragliding at the OSMP board meeting in November, we've been partnering closely with Lisa Goncalo on the precautionary landings issue, and we're excited by the progress that we are making. I've reviewed the report that she provided to the OSMP board, and I feel that it thoroughly and accurately represents the situation. We're deeply grateful for her efforts, as well as the support of the OSMP board. To briefly give background on the issue, cross-country paragliding involves traveling significant distances using only the power of sun and wind. Since we don't have engines, we sometimes don't get the updrafts that we need and that we expect and we need to land. This scenario is similar to running out of gas while on the highway. We're going to land somewhere, but we have some degree of choice on where we land. Current city regulations prohibit us from landing on OSMP property, which generally would otherwise provide ample opportunities for us to land safely for both ourselves and for other users. Paraglider pilots have been making decisions which sometimes compromise their own safety in order to avoid being issued a ticket with a mandatory court summons. Lisa has proposed updating the city regulations to explicitly allow precautionary landings when they are required for safety. We don't believe that this will significantly increase landings outside of the designated landing areas, but we do think that it will greatly increase safety. We're continuing to work with Lisa on finding the precise wording that will give the rangers the necessary guidance on whether or not to issue a citation to a pilot who has landed outside of a designated landing area. We share OSMP goals of protecting Boulder's natural resources, and if a change to the regulations causes some unexpected negative impact in the future, we are absolutely open to partnering on solutions to those, whether that means reverting or changing the regulations, improving pilot education, or anything else that is needed. It is deeply important to us that we are respecting the larger Boulder community and its resources when we recreate. While our primary focus has been on the landings, we're looking forward to further partnering with OSMP on more issues in the future, including protecting the launch area from erosion and exploring new launch areas on the hogback north of Wonderland Lake. If anyone has any concerns or would ever like to open a dialogue with me and the Rocky Mountain Hang Gliding and Paragliding Association, my contact information is available on rmhpa.org. I would be happy to discuss this with anybody. Thank you so much.
Okay, and if you are joining online and would like to speak, you can raise your hand. Next, we have Mike Browning. Mike, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, my name is Mike Browning. I've lived in Southwest Boulder for 30 years. Was a practicing attorney in Boulder for 40 years, specializing in water rights and real estate transactions. I also I want to raise a couple issues with respect to the Hodges property. When I first heard about the possible disposal of the site, it was said that it would be accompanied by a conservation easement to protect some of the conservation values on the property. I want to urge you that you really need to see the details of the conservation easement before deciding whether to dispose of this property or retain it. If you don't have a conservation easement on the property, you have no control over the property going forward when it comes to a third party. And there are values in the property, including the wetlands in the north end, the conveyance of water across the property to serve the wetlands and marsh areas to the east of the property, as well as the view corridor itself. So my understanding was that the disposal was going to be conditioned on a conservation easement, but conservation easements come in all flavors and types. So you need to find out, you need to have the staff develop a conservation easement so you can see it and the public can see it before you make any disposal decisions. Among the issues that need to be addressed in the conservation easement, as I say, are the protection of the existing wetlands on the north end of the property. You need to make sure that the drainages that go across that parcel to provide water to the marsh area and wetlands east of the property are not altered by any development. And you need to protect that view corridor. As has been mentioned, the view corridor was the reason for the purchase of the property some years ago. And it's an important southern entrance to the city, so that view corridor needs to be maintained. So there must be some restrictions in the conservation easement if the property is sold as to what can be built there. You don't want 3 stories of row homes to block the view corridor into a vast amount of open space that is to the east of that property. And as I say, you have to protect the existing marsh and wetlands and the conveyance of water through those areas. And finally, the property was purchased a number of years ago because of its importance as the southern entryway to the city and the views across the open space there to the east. So there needs to be, if the property is sold, there needs to be protections in the conservation easement about what can be done. But I think the easier thing is to just maintain control and ownership of that property. You're not going to get much money out of it, particularly if there are conservation easements put on it as are required. It seems like ownership of that property gives you the most control over the future and protection of the conservation values that are there. So please make an effort, require the staff to develop a conservation easement before you even consider disposal. Thank you very much.
Next, we have Donna. Donna, if you could also identify yourself with your last name as well when you speak. Donna, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hello, my name is Donna George, and I just recently heard about this Hodges possible disposal of open space, and I'm very quite concerned on why anyone would consider disposing of this. As previous speakers have talked about, there's a view corridor here. It's got agricultural uses. And I'm assuming from what I've heard is that the reason they want to dispose of it is because there's buildings there that may be degrading, and they want to get rid of those buildings. Well, I want to remind everyone of a property on Baseline. There was a building on that property. It was an open space property, and they said in order to help that property to restore it, they had to annex it into open space. So they annexed it into open space. And then after they annexed it into open space, annexed it into the city in order to be able to do this work on this house that was on that property, later on, they totally tore down the property. And now that property is now in the city of Boulder, annexed into the city of Boulder, and it is open space. And if you're thinking of disposing a property just because there's a building on it that might be degrading, you are totally getting the trust of the community out the window. I mean, it's gone. All you have to do is either dispose of that property or restore that property, but this property needs to remain an open space. I want to know what's the real reason behind your trying to dispose of this open space and possibly put housing on it. If you start putting housing on property that was bought by the citizens using tax dollars for open space, you have totally lost the trust of the citizens within the city. Also, what's this? If you then annex it, is that a reason to try to annex another property nearby? What is actually going on behind the scenes of trying to dispose of this property just because there's a building on it that might be degrading? This definitely needs to remain an open space, and I want you to look at that property on Baseline that was annexed into the city because there was a building that needed to be worked on, and then they ended up just tearing down that building, and then it remained within the city of Boulder annexed and did not go back into Area 3 open space. Thank you for your time. This needs to remain as open space and not be disposed of. Thank you for your time.
If you're joining online and would like to speak, you can raise your hand now. Okay, we don't have additional hands.
Okay. Wow. Thank you very much for all the members of the public who spoke to us tonight. Very, very grateful that you came and addressed the board, and we'll consider all of your comments. That closes public comment if I didn't say that. And actually, if there are any trustee reactions to public comment that we want to talk about, this is a time during matters from the board when we can do that. Sarah?
I really appreciated the comments coming from, I believe it was Paula and Mary, in regards to the comp plan and how we're presenting farming and agriculture. And we'll have more time to discuss that as we discuss the comp plan. But I thought reading the emails and then hearing and seeing about that today, it's been on my mind, and I was happy to hear and see public comment coming in, and look forward to more dialogue on that later.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. And you might have been talking about Elizabeth.
Thank you, and please forgive me, Elizabeth. My brain is only about half online right now, in the middle of my treatment.
Did you have something, Michelle? Oh, well, no, let's talk. Oh, you want to talk about 7C in the context of this public comment? Yeah.
Oh, well, in the context of the section, the section of written information.
Yeah, we can mix it up. That's fine.
Go ahead.
Thanks. I think this is a section where we also talk about comments on the written information items, 7C. And I was wondering if staff could tell me a little bit more about the April intercept surveys, and then like how are they conducted, the kinds of questions Are they verbal? Are they on an iPad? Are they, how do you choose the sites? Are you on the trails, on the trailheads? I don't think I've ever been intercepted before. At least in city of Boulder. I have been in like up on Boulder County open space, but I haven't seen city of Boulder. And I think Boulder County used an iPad. So just curious if you could tell us more about just what intercept surveys are going to look like.
Sure, I'll have Casey join me too. But yeah, intercept surveys has been a fairly common approach for us over the last 5 or 6 years. I believe our human dimensions team is the one that leads those. I think it does involve iPads out on the system. But yeah, if any more details that
Sure.
might exist from what I know usually happens, and maybe this approach.
Yeah, a lot of this does rely on the human dimensions team, so I'm going to go from memory with our collaboration with them. But yes, it will be on an iPad, Michelle. And the human dimensions teams takes in a couple of factors when choosing locations, taking into account some visitation.
Casey, real quick, would you just introduce yourself for the public?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Casey French, Planning and Design Senior Manager with Open Space Mountain Parks. So they're looking at if we're going to get have people to intercept. So we want to make sure that they are locations that get frequent enough visitation, a variety of types of access points, and then making sure there's distribution across the system. And then the questions for development, we've planning and HD have been collaborating on looking at how people are arriving, the modes, barriers, and will be similar to the questions that are going to be in the questionnaire as well in the April engagement window. So they mirror each other to a certain extent. So I don't want to go into all the details of those right now. They're still being refined for the engagement window, but they focus on some strategies as well.
Okay, so you said that they'll be the same questions on the online survey.
Yes.
They will be mirrored. Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm just curious, I know that you're going to there are 3 engagement windows, the one in April, and then there's a Q3 and Q4. Will those also have intercept surveys?
No.
Just
the first
one.
engagement window will
Okay.
have the intercept.
Okay. And what will the second and third engagement windows look like?
Well, we haven't mapped out our entire engagement plan for that, but each one will have a questionnaire, and then we will also look to see what in-person engagement opportunities we might complement with that. But we're going to look at a variety of in-person or online.
Okay, I see. Thanks.
Yep.
Ready?
Yeah, I guess just talking about 7C since that's what we're talking about right now. Lots of passion in the public still. And it's just interesting to reflect back on the West TSA and the decisions we made back then. And I mean, a lot has changed. We can make changes. We're not necessarily wedded to things we did 14 years ago. And just one of the things, just thinking out loud here a little bit, is a lot of times the arguments against mountain bikes in open space, I just hear people just list a long list of species, but it doesn't identify the mechanism by which mountain bikes would bring about some kind of catastrophic thing on these front country lands. I mean, I understand they're protected grasslands, but I'm just not always as persuaded by that personally. But I think the thing that's really consistent and that I can certainly relate to is what it feels like to be on a trail that's being shared. And I've shared this before, but having, been walking on a trail with a small kid and suddenly you're worried about your kid's safety or somebody else. And so I just really would encourage staff to think about separation and to be really explicit about, ways that we can artfully build something into the landscape to make this connector. And yeah, somebody said it best. It might have been from Audubon. I'm sorry, I don't forget your name, but there, yeah. Oh, sorry, somebody said it well from Audubon that just trying to balance all these things, and sometimes we can't balance everything. That's true, but I'm sympathetic to people who really value being able to walk in this section of open space without feeling like you have to have an ear behind your head all the time and be ready to dodge out of the way. I just want you all to know that I am sympathetic to that, and my commitment to you all is to, and maybe I speak for the board, is to take these things all into account. It's not a fait accompli in terms of just going through the motion, and this is just going to get railroaded through. So I just wanted to say that. Another thing on my mind is the Hodges property. I mean, I don't think there's a conspiracy going on here. Somebody insinuated that there was. Also insinuated that we've forgotten why we're here as a board. That is not the case here. I mean, I think it's eliciting more passion than I had expected. That being said, if this city acquires properties and there are other ways to advance our goals other than always having fee simple ownership, if every time we think about a strategic disposal because there are more efficient ways to conserve and we're going to get attacked for having forgotten why we're here, well, maybe that's just part of what it means to serve on this board in Boulder. But there are other ways to achieve our goals, and so I think in this case, I think we have to take a hard look at it. We're going to be having a discussion on April 8th, is my understanding. I'd be really curious to hear about, anyway, addressing all the things that have been brought up. And there's been a lot of passion, a lot of great thoughts on that. And then we're going to be having a potential vote on disposal on June 10th. Is that right, Dan? Is that the kind of rough?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and going from your concerns last month and now hearing a lot of community concerns, we took the one meeting that was in March, spread that over 2 meetings, and fully want to work with the board to see if that time frame is not even adequate. So what we're thinking for April is to actually talk, a little bit more specific about Hodges, but also talk a little bit about the pros and cons of conservation easements, the pros and cons of ownership, what fits where, can we achieve our protections for certain values we want to protect, through which mechanism, which pros and cons. So, and eventually talk a little bit more about Hodges in April, but certainly wanting to maybe take a little bit of a step back and talk a little bit more about the conservation easement approach, as well as a little bit of context of what do those 40 buildings across our system look like, and really, in reality, when we talk about either disposing going from a fee ownership to a conservation easement approach, or in some cases removing the building and just having raw land, we are talking about out of those 40 residences, just a couple of buildings that ends up kind of, in our thinking, falls into those categories. Hey, let's discuss some options here. So as a staff, there is no nefarious thing other than nefarious. Did I say nefarious? Nefarious motives behind it, but wanting to have an open discussion and dialogue with you about what is the best approach for those certain properties, and using Hodges as a specific example.
That's great, Dan. Thank you for that. I think reasonable minds can disagree on this one, and I look forward to more discussion and, frankly, personally getting more educated on this. But I just want to say, for the sake of this board and the public, I hope that we as a department can have disposal on the table when there are other more efficient means of achieving our goals that we could achieve by potentially occasionally strategically disposing. It doesn't mean we've forgotten what our mandate is necessarily. We've got less money to do more things with, and occasionally things have to give, and we have to be able to have we have to have different strategies on the table other than just brute force owning everything forever, I think. And so I just encourage the public to keep that in mind from my perspective. Anyway, that's enough for me. Thank you.
Yeah, Brady, and I appreciate you calling that out. And I think that's important to say. I think when somebody accuses a board or a staff of or insinuates some sort of nefarious purpose, it's like they weren't here last month when we talked about needing to see the conservation easement. They weren't here when staff said, "Oh, well, if you really want to see how this is going to work, we're going to take this out for 3 more months over 2 more meetings and really leave room for open discussion and daylight in front of the public." So, I don't generally like to have a colloquy when somebody accuses me of something. It's like, well, I'm on a board. this is what happens. But I appreciate you calling that out, and I think that was a good move.
Yeah, thanks.
Could I jump in there on the Hodges property as well? I do think, it's not the first time or the last time I'll probably be accused of being involved in a grand conspiracy since I've been on the board. But I do think, based on the feedback I've gotten from the community, just how fast we've moved on this has kind of pushed us to the point where we've entered kind of an unhealthy discourse with the community. And I would love to encourage the community to have a healthy discourse with us, right? Like last month, we were here, we asked for more information. We had a lot of the same concerns you did. And that's why we're taking this more slowly. So I would encourage us as we're looking at other property disposals to, make sure we give it the time and space, that it needs for the public to be able to engage with us and healthy discourse. Because this one felt really fast. I had people message me on Nextdoor actually saying, what happened? Why isn't it on the agenda? Why did it change? Right. And I was able to provide them with some information, but it seemed very sudden to the community how fast we were moving on that. So I would encourage us to take the time, and I think we are now on this issue. So, and I would encourage the community to keep talking to us, keep sharing with us your feelings on this issue in a healthy way.
Thanks, John. I also appreciate the way you put that. Okay. Any other responses to public comment or responses regarding the written information on the multimodal assessment that we saw? Yeah? No? Okay, well then this brings us to a bittersweet item on the agenda called item 4B, outgoing trustee recognition. Michelle, it has been a real pleasure to serve with you on this board. We've got some gifts for you and a proclamation that I'm going to read. I get the black and white, you get the color one to take home. Okay. So let's start with, I also envision other members of the board being able to have some time to speak. So I'm just going to read the proclamation for starters and get us kicked off. Okay, so this says proclamation. A proclamation recognizing the dedication and volunteer service of Michelle Estrella to open space and mountain parks 2021 to 2026. Whereas Michelle Estrella has served honorably and with distinction on the Open Space Board of Trustees since 2021. She was the board's chair during the 2024-25 session. Out of her respect for staff, fellow trustees, and the public, including working parents, she has championed efficient and productive meetings which timely conclude. And in addition to Michelle's dedication to her board activities, she has logged almost 700 hours volunteering on open space and mountain parks projects. Whereas Michelle has shown immense dedication in her service to this community. She has developed meaningful and productive relationships with her peer trustees and with OSMP staff. Always an advocate for safe and accessible recreation and equitable and fair access to public lands, Michelle has given voice and opportunity to a broad spectrum of current and prospective users of the OSMP system. Whereas Michelle has been an effective and influential member of the OSBT. She has helped shape the direction of board retreats, provided insightful feedback on the budget process, and led conversations for many important topics, including equity, wildfire resiliency, climate action, Fort Chambers Poor Farm site planning, assessment of e-bikes on OSMP trails, the North Foothills Bikeway, the Boulder to Erie Regional Trail, climbing access trails, multimodal access, and enhanced bike infrastructure at trailheads. Based on Michelle's urging, staff incorporated a list of potential 6-year projects into conversations with the board, which gives the public a transparent, clear picture of the department's work plan. Michelle's work as a trustee will have a lasting impact on the board and the department. Therefore, I, Harmon Zuckerman, Chair of the Open Space Board of Trustees, do hereby proclaim that the leadership exhibited by Michelle Estrella over the past 5 years has been instrumental to the success of this board and the Open Space and Mountain Parks Department. Proclaimed this 11th day of March in the year 2026 on behalf of the Open Space Board of Trustees and the Open Space and Mountain Parks Department. Thank you, Michelle. Would you like to say any words?
Uh, Thanks. Gosh, we're reflecting at dinner tonight about how quickly 5 years goes by, and it does. It didn't always feel that way though, because early on we did have a lot of really late meetings, and I did champion trying to run more efficient meetings. And during the time that I was here, we staff also had a baby boom, and so I think and seeing these new moms and dads come in here, and I always knew that if we had a 1 a.m. meeting and I still had to go to work the next day and I had to get the kids to school the next day, I was like, I had many thoughts of like, why am I doing this? Or like how, and so that's really why I cared so much about that particular transition in our culture as a board. I mean, yes, we did a lot of cool things during my time here, but I think that's one of the most important ones because it allows more people to do board service. So you can't don't have to just be retired to be able to serve on a board. You can actually have kids at home, and they're left at home tonight, but made them dinner anyway. But you can have kids at home, and you can have a career, and you can still also serve your community. And so that's the one thing I'm really proud that, and I didn't do that alone because I had you all here too. But that's one of the main things that I'm proud of during my time here. Also, just mentioned that we during my time we had CU South annexation. That was really intense, and that was like my first year. We City Council allowed up to class 2 e-bikes on open space trails. So that was a really big deal. OSBT didn't actually approve that, but because the vote went down 2-3, but council did approve it based on all of the feedback that we had gotten. So, North Sky Trail opened during my time. The June before that trail opened, we had lots of people coming in telling us the sky was going to fall because there are going to be mountain bikes on this trail. And by the way, the sky hasn't fallen. So stay buckled in, stay engaged, and definitely listen to everybody, and also just take a real approach to it. And yes, I'm super excited that we are seeing more bike racks at trailheads. Every time I see a new rack go up, I'm cheering, and I'll be happy when one shows up at Cragmore for sure. I'll be texting Jeff. But mainly, I just wanted to, thank the people I've had a chance to work with. Staff has been really great. I've learned so many things during every meeting from staff and also from the community. People in the world, changes because people show up. So keep showing up. We're listening to you. I just want to thank these people here next to me because we've all grown over this time. We've gone through some great times, some hard times, and happy that Sarah's here tonight. Thanks for coming for my last meeting. So dedication to service. You can go through some hard stuff in your life, and the community's here for you, and we're here for you too, Sarah. So thank you for coming tonight. Anyway, thank you all for my 5 years here. It's been lovely.
That was beautiful, and we're not done with you yet. We've got a couple gifts to bestow
And
upon you,
maybe a few of us have
and a
got
few,
comments too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So-
and what so yeah, we've got a couple gifts to give you, and folks on the board might want to say some things. Brady especially wants to say something. So
You were going forward with gifts, and we were going to be able to say nice things about Michelle. I will just add, Michelle, that you're very detail oriented. I mean, a very few minutes got through your scrutiny, and so we'll see if that maintains. And you're also really good at working to get people excited about serving on this board. And you've been an incredible advocate for board service generally, to making us, helping us to end on a reasonable time for people with lives, but then also kind of being a champion outside and getting more people to apply to a process that's opaque to most. I think that's incredible. And bike racks. So thank you so much. It's been great to serve with you on yet another board.
Sarah?
Well, I was going to share with you, Michelle, the broader community impact and just to say thank you for introducing me to this board and encouraging me to apply. For example, I just had a delivery from one of our farm tenants of bone broth from the local, the cows, and I'm basically living on bone broth right now through my treatment. It's one of the things that I can really have. It keeps my protein up. I wouldn't have really gotten to know that farmer and had that relationship if it hadn't been through this board. I've also been sitting at the Rocky Mountain Cancer Center getting my treatments, looking over the open space, and I wouldn't have appreciated this open space or felt so optimistic while sitting through these cancer treatments. Like, really, what am I living for? I guess I get to be really dramatic and extreme in this situation. And it has been non-negotiable for me to stay tuned into this board because it means so much to me. So thank you for bringing me onto this board. And I will really miss you. And I will really miss your energy and your strength and your determination and your attention to detail and everything that you bring, both tangible and intangible, to this board. But I will, your presence will remain here, I think, at least for me, for my tenure for the next 3 years. So thank you.
Please. Okay. Michelle, I also want to thank you for your time on the board. The last 4 years working with you has been amazing, and you've had such an impact on the culture of this board, from meetings ending on time to making things more efficient in general. But one of the things I think we'll all remember most about you is your persistent advocacy for making our trailheads more welcoming to people by bikes and not taking no for an answer. It might sound like a small detail, but it represents something much bigger, helping people access open space in ways that align with our climate goals, our transportation goals, and our vision for a more connected community. So we wanted to give you something small that captures that impact. So we've got you a custom Yeti water bottle that features a mountain bike parked at a trailhead in front of the Flatirons as a small symbol of the change that you've pushed for and perspective you've brought to the board. Because thanks to your voice, future visitors will roll up to trailheads across Boulder, lock their bikes, and head out onto the trails, maybe without ever knowing the person who helped make that possible. So Michelle, thank you for your leadership, your thoughtfulness, and your commitment to open space.
And the bike's not just parked at a trailhead; it's locked to a
A
bike rack.
Yes, I lie. It is tight, locked to a bike rack.
Oh my gosh, that is so good. Oh my God, that is so good. I love that. Thank you.
Oh, that was a very inspired gift, and so that one is from staff. Feel free to open that.
There's no bike rack. But it's from Marshall Mesa.
Thank you. It's gorgeous. Wow. Lovely. Who's the photographer?
I was just looking it up because I didn't write it down.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just on behalf of staff, we really appreciate everything that's been said. I mean, I don't really have too much more to add from a staff perspective, but I would just say your sometimes tough but fair questioning is really appreciated. It makes us really think through things more, which is the whole point sometimes of a board from a staff's perspective is, are we thinking things through and gut checking ourselves? And that's a role you all play for us. And your very fair and thorough questioning always gets us prepared and always gets us thinking afterwards. And we really appreciate that. So, and the culture, of course, a lot of our staff are working parents, and sometimes we need to go to council the next night after a board meeting. And so ending around 9 as a goal has been really a wonderful thing for us in terms of work-life balance. And so wanted to just call out that too. So thank you.
So besides what I said in the proclamation, which is really from all of us, Michelle, I'd like to just thank you. It's been wonderful serving with you for the last 2.5 years since I came on the board. And, you and Shelley Dunbar were the first people who reached out to me about coming onto the board and who I spoke with, and you're instrumental in bringing me on to this board. And I just have really enjoyed working with you. You showed me a lot about what it is to be the chair of the board, taught me a lot, and the culture that you helped to create with Brady and John before I came on the board was a welcoming culture, and I hope we will continue to just expand on that and continue to make this board a wonderful board to serve on and to serve with each other and with the public and with the staff. You've set a great example, and we're going to be missing you a lot. So thank you much.
Thank you. I don't have any more words other than, am I now dismissed?
No, you
Oh,
actually
okay,
have
gotta
to.
keep going. Okay.
You've got to sit through the rest of this meeting, and I think now just be a great time for us to take a short break. Let's come back at 7:30. Reconvene the board at 7:30, and we'll get through the rest of the agenda.
Okay. Great. Moving into the matters from the department, I'm going to turn things right over to staff. This is our second touch of 3 for the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan update. This is still mainly an informed but welcoming feedback. And later this spring, we'll be back for a formal recommendation. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Joshua Schnabel, our principal planner with Open Space and Mountain Parks, and he'll introduce Christopher Johnson, who's here from Planning and Development Services. But Joshua.
Thanks, Dan. Yes, as Dan mentioned, my name is Joshua Schnabel. I am a principal planner at OSMP. I'm joined here tonight by Christopher Johnson, our colleague in comprehensive planning. And the main purpose of our being here tonight is to provide board members with an update regarding the status of the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, and just check in at this point. This is the second of 3 touch points we'll have with you. As you may recall, a preliminary draft of the plan was posted last Tuesday for public comment, and the public engagement period runs until April 6th. This is a follow-up to our previous update that we gave you in September. As a quick refresher for everyone, the comprehensive plan is a document that guides land management and community change within the Boulder Valley. It contains specific policy statements as well as a future land use map. And this is the 8th major update of the plan. So tonight we'll give you a general overview of our progress to date and also provide some specifics in 3 different areas. One of those areas being the revised policy statements, which I'll turn over to KJ to describe that. And we'll also have an update for you on the trails map and an update on our approach to land use designations, particularly open space and greenways. So let's dive right in. We'll start with a quick overview of where we are right now in the major update process. This is just a visual with our current time frame. We're now in phase 4, which is, we're calling it a Boulder Future. This is where we prepare the plan and get it ready for adoption this summer. As I mentioned, a preliminary draft of the plan was posted last Tuesday, March 3rd, for public comment, and the engagement window closes on the 6th of April. As far as OSBT's role right now, we'll be gathering your input tonight, and we'll come back to you in May with a request for a motion on the open space related elements of the plan. Okay, I'll get a little bit closer here. All right, so now to the policies. We'll have KJ take it from here for the next few slides.
Great, thank you, Joshua. Good evening, trustees. Good to see all of you. Christopher Johnson. I'm the Comprehensive Planning Senior Manager within Planning and Development Services. Why don't you go ahead and flip to the next slide? So I'm going to provide just a brief overview of really more of the approach to policies. I won't get into a lot of detail on the real specifics of all of the open space related policies, but as we began the process to update the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, we really had a number of goals, most of which were around how do we make this document more clear, more understandable for the general user. There are many different users of the plan throughout the process. There are community members, there are policymakers, there might be development interests, and then there's staff as well. So we want to make sure that this is a very clear and understandable and useful document for everybody as we move forward. So as we looked at all of the policies within the current plan, which was last had a major update in 2015, there are 210 of those policies, and our approach was really to let's focus on clarity of language. Let's reduce the redundancy that we see within the plan. Let's make sure that it is simple and easy to read and really understandable for all those users. And then really kind of an outcome of doing that is to make the plan and make the policies more resilient. So by providing some greater flexibility and raise the elevation of those policies to make them a bit more broad, we allow for conditions to change and we don't box ourselves into a corner inadvertently by providing too much specificity in a policy that would then limit our options if something changes. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, there were 210. I'll go back one.
Sorry about that.
There we go. Yep. As I mentioned, there are 210 policies in the current version of the comprehensive plan. This is I wanted to point out an example that this happens to be a policy around wetlands and riparian protection. Many of the policies that are in the current plan tend to provide a lot of additional context, and many times that information is really not needed. You highlighted in the green box is really the policy that we are looking for, and oftentimes it gets sort of buried within this longer narrative around sort of the overall goals of that policy. They also tend to introduce a lot of description of how we are going to actually implement a certain policy. For example, at the end of this, you may not be able to read it, but it specifically references the OSMP Grassland Ecosystem Management Plan. That's great, and it may seem trivial, but what happens if that management plan goes by a different name? What if that plan evolves and changes over time, and we have this reference then that becomes inaccurate? They also oftentimes go through and use a lot of technical language. Planners have a great way of speaking in tongues and using a lot of jargon. So we want to make sure that they're usable by the average community member. Go ahead and go to the next one. So in the draft plan that is out and that is available to everyone, we have reduced the number of policies from 210 down to 102. So we basically cut that in half. The policies are really written to be aspirational. They lead with what the policy is right off the bat. They say exactly what it is what the policy is and why it is important to the community. And then they avoid getting into the real detailed descriptions of how we might implement that. So they remain aspirational. They are written for clarity. And as you can see, this is about as close to a one-to-one comparison as we can make because we've sort of reevaluated and reconstituted a lot of those policies. But you can see this is much more succinct. It's much clearer. Really dives into the reason for wetland and riparian area and what the city's policy is right off the bat. So on the next slide, you'll see there are a lot of open space related policies, about 40% roughly within the plan. That is obviously representative of the value that we place in open space and in the environment. Some of these are directly related to open space, some of them, a bit more indirectly. And I just wanted to mention too, really in response to Ms. Black's comments, and I don't see Ms. Schuler in the room any longer, but the great thing about their comments is that this is the purpose of the draft plan as it exists right now. This is the point in which the community can help us identify any red flags, any gaps, any aha moments of we've missed something. And so we're certainly open to and willing to work with OSMP staff as we revise the plan for that next iteration to take into consideration some of those comments.
Okay, thanks for that. So now we'll turn to the next topic. And this is the topic of how the BVCP Trails Map has evolved into a description of regional connections for this update. So here in this slide, you can see the direction we've started to take to identify regional trail connections. We're still continuing to work with our comp plan colleagues here as well as with Boulder County to determine the best way to represent these. But where previous versions of the plan displayed a trails map that contained all system trails, including the proposed reroutes, which is what you see in the center image. The intent here for this major update is to simplify the map, reduce the clutter, and focus the BVCP on the agreed upon aspirational connections that represent our shared interest between agencies. And these are listed on the left, although it's a bit hard to read, and they're displayed on that right-hand image. So this would not cover the totality of all potential trail connections, since those are already contained within other plans, and I'll speak to that a little bit. This is just illustrating the agreed upon regional trail connections that cross jurisdictional boundaries and require that interagency cooperation. So for more background on that, this diagram shows where OSMP trails planning happens within the context of overall planning within the city's framework. Plans for OSMP trails are included in OSMP's department level plans, and those are, that's that green box toward the bottom in the middle. The comprehensive plan, which is shown here in dark blue, is intended to be a high-level planning document that's focused on policy. It promotes regional collaboration, and it highlights these aspirational connections that cross jurisdictional boundaries. However, trails specific to OSMP, which may still connect into that larger regional trail network, are contained within our departmental plans. These plans, as you can kind of see here, take their guidance from the SARE framework above and the BVCP and the citywide strategic plan. And they exist sort of within this diagram. So this shows how specific trail planning occurs within the structure of our department level plans. And you'll see most of OSMP trails planning occurs as part of those trail study areas or integrated site planning efforts there toward the bottom. And again, this is in contrast to those more aspirational regional trail connections that would be described in the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. And with that, I'll move into the topic of land use designations, which is really a key feature of the comprehensive plan. I'll give us all a moment to take this in. This is the revised land use structure for the plan. It's just a visualization of the way land use designations now appear in the updated plan. Previous iteration had 26 land use designations, and today we have 12 unique designations. And you'll see the two that we put stars next to, those are greenways and open space, and those are the two that we'll discuss tonight. But first, let's start with a quick refresher on open space. As you probably recall from our update in September, the previous BVCP included 3 open space land use designations, and I think we're all intimately familiar with these. Open space acquired, or OSA, which applied to land use already acquired for open space purposes. OSDR, which is open space development rights, which applied to privately owned land with existing conservation easements or other development restrictions. And OSO, open space other, which applied to other public and private land designated prior to 1981 that the city and county wanted to preserve through various preservation methods. However, by itself, this designation did not ensure open space protection. So back in September, we had proposed to consolidate the OSO and OSDR designations into an open space values overlay and retain just the OSA designation. And the OSA designation would have become the new open space land use designation. And so based on what we've learned by going through the exercise of cleaning up the OSO layer, which I'll cover in the next few slides, we've come up with a revised strategy to handle that open space designation. This is a visual kind of outlining our revised approach. To help make sense of this slide, I think I'd like to just draw everyone's attention to the definition of open space on the far right. And that is land used for open space purposes, either through direct ownership by the city or county, conservation easements held on private land, or other contractual obligations like management or annexation agreements. So we intentionally broadened that definition of open space. And that allowed us to include those lands which would be classified under OSDR. And this was done in response to some board feedback that we received from you when we met back in September. And so with that in mind, the approach that we're proposing now is that OSA would still become open space, and features from OSDR from that classification would also be added to the open space designation. As an aside here, additionally, all parcels that have that OSDR designation would be tagged in the city's database so that when development is proposed on a property with OSDR, city planning staff would be notified to check with OSMP. The OSO designation would still go away, and the appropriate land use designation would be applied in its place. For example, you kind of see this here at the bottom. University, facilities and services, or rural lands, those designations could be applied. There are a few rare instances where OSO polygons that we found in this layer are actually representative of current acquisitions, like CU South, or existing contractual obligations. They wouldn't be removed. Instead, they would become part of that new open space land use designation, so they would be preserved. And to help describe what led us to this new approach as we start to absorb all of this, I'll just briefly walk through a few examples of what we discovered in the process of trying to clean up the OSO layer. So we found that these OSO fragments, which I'll show on the next few slides, some examples of, they generally fell into one of three types. Type 1 were generally water features. Type 2 were areas with no open space values within city limits. And what we call type 3 are these areas in unincorporated portions of the county where OSO was inconsistently being applied. So here we have an example of OSO type 1. These are polygons that closely align with ditches, tributaries, other bodies of water for which comprehensive protections already exist. So this picture shows how OSO was basically applied to ditches through developed residential areas. And because these features already receive adequate protection, we found that the OSO designation isn't needed. It didn't add any value. And artifacts like this were present throughout the system. Here's an example of OSO type 2. This is a category that captures those remnants of OSO that do not contain open space values. You can see this is a fragment of OSO that still exists over a developed area adjacent to an acquisition that occurred in 1985. There were a lot of these leftover traces that had apparently just never been removed from the data layer following acquisitions. But actually, the presence of these is sort of evidence that the OSO data layer had served its intended purpose, because what you're seeing here are these vestiges adjacent to acquisitions that had occurred where the alignment wasn't precise, but you still have the remaining or the leftover fragments of OSO. Here's another example of OSO called type 2. So in this case, there's no adjacent acquisition. We can't really say whether or not they originally contained open space values, but what we can say is that there are clearly none at present. Or they're hard to define because these properties have largely been developed over time. That's actually right next to a roadway. And then finally, we have type 3. So these are areas in unincorporated Boulder County that may or may not contain open space values, but where those values aren't reliably or comprehensively identified. So the spatial distribution of OSO, and I'll show another image of this in a couple of slides. In these areas, it was incomplete or arbitrary. It didn't seem to make any logical sense. And we found in these cases, in unincorporated areas, the environmental resources maps contained in the Boulder County Comprehensive Plan already identify these lands. So we can see an example of this here, where this portion of OSO shown on the right aligns with what the Boulder County Comprehensive Plan calls significant agricultural lands. That's a feature with existing resource protections in that plan. And there are many of these maps. So county comprehensive plan maps are what guide land use decision making in unincorporated Boulder County. That significant agricultural lands layer is just one of many that identify natural resources of value. And here are a few more examples: critical wildlife habitat and migration corridors, environmental conservation areas, high biodiversity areas, rare plants and significant natural communities. So whereas we saw that OSO was applied really arbitrarily throughout the county comprehensive plan identifies these resources very comprehensively. And so when we zoom out, you can see the entire system and how scattered the OSO appears outside the city boundaries. The city is actually blacked out, and that gray buffer area is a 0.5 mile buffer distance from existing OSMP managed parcels. So because we wanted to be completely certain and out of an abundance of caution, we wanted to ensure that by removing these OSO designations, we weren't losing the ability to comment on any proposed development on lands in these unincorporated areas. So when we ran this analysis, which is kind of shown here, we were able to verify that if any development were to be proposed on lands where OSO is removed, OSMP would still receive adequate notice from the county. And so ultimately, the OSO designation adds no additional protection. So that covers open space and land use designation. Additionally, like I mentioned, there's another land use designation called greenways that's being proposed for this major update to the BVCP. The new greenways designation, as its definition currently states, would apply to areas adjacent to natural urban waterways within city limits, including Boulder Creek and tributary streams, that serve one or more of the following functions: to help manage and mitigate flooding, to support multifunctional landscapes and ecosystem services, and to protect cultural resources. And so greenways can also offer recreation and active transportation, but the designation itself doesn't necessarily imply access. Open space charter purposes still apply to lands with this designation. You can see an example of this. Greenways is in dark green. It kind of overlaps that lighter green, which is open space. So although they overlap in some areas, open space land is still a primary component, and the greenways designation will apply for the purpose of illustrating this sort of system-wide connectivity, but open space charter purposes still apply. And so that sort of concludes each of those portions of the BVCP that I wanted to draw our attention to. And we can facilitate a discussion about any of those. I've queued up a few questions in advance to help guide us, and also included in the bottom right a time frame. So given the schedule that we're on for this major update, now is a really good opportunity to delve into any questions that the board has. And I'll also let KJ speak to any upcoming next steps in terms of schedule.
Yeah, thank you. So the draft that is out and available for public comment and review, as Joshua mentioned, closes on April 6th. And we staff have a number of board meetings through the month of March. We're also meeting with planning board and city council, and then the county approval bodies through the end of the month and the early part of April. We will then go and make revisions to the plan and release a final recommended draft in mid-May. The goal is, as I think you all know, Open Space Board of Trustees needs to make a formal recommendation to council on any open space related policies or land use map changes. So we would be looking for that recommendation to come at your May 13th meeting, and that would tee us up very well then for a joint public hearing that we have scheduled for Planning Board and City Council starting on June 4th. So that'll be the first sort of formal adoption hearing with Planning Board and City Council on the 4th of June. So that's why we are looking for and hoping to receive your recommendation in advance of that meeting.
And before I turn things over to you, Harm, I just want to make one clarification when it was mentioned that the OS open space layer applies to CU South. It applies to the 119 acres that is going to be coming over to OSMP, not the full CU South property. So just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you guys a lot for that presentation, and I can see all the, but not all of, but as it relates to what you proposed to us tonight, I can see the trajectory of the plan and how you're really evolving it based on what you're hearing back from us and from others. So thank you for that. I'm going to open it up to board comments at this point, and if Sarah is on, we can take her comment as well if she's gotten back to where she's on a computer and can make herself heard. So for those of us who are here, anybody want to start? Ready?
First, congratulations on simplifying. I think that is some kind of incredible victory over government entropy to come out of something like this with less words, less goals, more clarity. That's great. So thank you for that. Congratulations. I see other people looking at the ag section, and so everyone just feel free to jump in. I've got a few questions after this, but I'm just curious to hear your all's reaction to the comments about. I think some members of the community felt like the extent to which we have agricultural land was or under characterized. And so I'd love to hear a reaction to that. And then also to someone like me, I don't understand, what does that actually mean? Like getting this right in the plan, taking this feedback into account, how's that going to change things on the ground over the next period of years?
Yeah, great question. So I would say broadly speaking, we our team has directly received the comments from Ms. Schuler and Ms. Black, as well as I know they distributed them to all of you. So we've received those. I think broadly speaking, a lot of their recommendations are very reasonable and can be accommodated. As I mentioned earlier, this is really the opportunity for the community to identify those gaps that we may have missed. And so we appreciate the attention to detail and make sure that, that we're not missing those and that we are characterizing the full agricultural portfolio that is, central to a lot of OSMP's work, and make sure that we capture that correctly. So we will work closely with Dan and staff and really the rest of the team, to make appropriate updates and then include those in the recommended plan. As far as how this then trickles down into implementation, we do have some description in the draft plan itself that speaks to how we put the plan into action. I will say that there is a part of the clarity, efforts that we've made. There's also a little bit of a shift in terms of thinking how the comprehensive plan sort of sits within our overall citywide planning framework, and then how that ultimately gets implemented over time. I don't know how much awareness or description has been provided yet, but in terms of the citywide strategic plan, which is really more of a 4-year kind of operational plan that is aligned with the city council terms, that is really the sort of primary implementation step that comes below the comprehensive plan and then moves into those department plans that Joshua kind of referenced before. I think the value of making sure that we have the language correct in the comprehensive plan is that it really does establish that future roadmap for decision making. And so if we happen to miss something or inadvertently mischaracterize something, that could affect a decision down the road. And so that's why it's important for us to make sure that the language is clear and that it's correct. So we want to make sure that we're doing that appropriately, and that's why we go through this multiple cycle of reviews, not only with staff and subject matter experts from various departments, but also with the community as well.
That's a good question. And I think that just as an editorial comment from me as a fellow board member, you know, in certain other boards really pay attention to the comp plan a lot. So, you know, if you're in a discretionary review process, like a site review for a planning project, and let's say you want to put a residential development in a light industrial zone, the planning board might look at that and say, wait a minute, we've got this policy in the comp plan that says we don't want to displace light industrial in Boulder. There's precious little light industrial left in this town. Where can you get a vacuum cleaner repaired here anymore? So there's this comp plan policy that says you're not supposed to do that. So, you know, we're going to deny this site review. We tend to make most of our decisions on open space board based on our own internal departmental plan. We don't look at the policies, the goals and policies of the comp plan as much. We take it for granted that and this is my editorial, I'm not speaking for anybody but me, but I think that we take it for granted, or I take it for granted, that the goals and policies that are mentioned in the master plan for the open space and mountain parks department flow down from the comprehensive plan and don't contradict the comprehensive plan. But we don't look up to the comprehensive plan as much as other departments do, or as much as other boards do, probably. So I think that's a great question you asked, Brady. And, you know, maybe it's a time to look more at the comp plan, especially since, you know, KJ's taken a hatchet to it. So it's got a lot more sort of overarching themes involved.
Thanks. Thank you for that.
Please
I got a
keep
few other
going.
questions. So, very quickly, thought experiment. So, under the new open space designations, if there was open space that we owned, which was previously open space A, OSA, and we disposed of it but retained a conservation easement, under your definitions, that would still be open space. Even though the fee ownership was disposed, it could potentially remain open space. And could you comment on that?
I think that would be synonymous with an OSDR designation as we see it today. So it would, according to the new approach that we're using, it would come under the open space land use designation.
But it would look on the map the same, even though we don't own it in fee anymore.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add one additional point of clarification that, you know, the particularly around open space A, OSA, the way the current land use designation works and the way the map works today is that that's very reflective of ownership and really doesn't describe the use as clearly. And the way that we are proposing to sort of evolve this land use framework is that it really focuses on what is the future vision for the use of that property in the future, regardless of the ownership. And so what's critical about the open space designation is that, you know, per the charter, if it is owned by and managed by OSMP, those open space purposes are defined by the charter, and essentially that is the characteristic of the use that you would see on that property in the future, whether or not it's actually fee owned or if it's under a conservation easement. And you know, similar logic applies to if it's owned by the county's open space department as well.
Right. And under this regime, I would just say that those conservation easements become incredibly important to maintain what we mean by open space, or this becomes potentially less and less meaningful. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so let me just set some ground rules here. You know, we usually have a policy on the board where if you have multiple questions, you just ask one and then go down the line.
Sorry.
But you know, I know we all have multiple questions for staff on this one. So I think if you've got something that's germane to what we're talking about, you can jump in. And it's just going to be a free for all tonight, if that's all right with everybody. So I've got a question that goes along with what Brady just asked, so I'm going to jump in. So if the underlying land use map designation is going to dictate, and I've said this before in this room, that it's really important in my mind for planning purposes in multiple departments for the underlying land use map designations that you guys are working on to clearly say somewhere that this land use designation supports the following zone districts, right? We need to know that medium density residential supports MHR, supports, you know, DT2, whatever, right? So we know where the zone districts fit in. With that as a basis, and I don't know if you agree with me there, but with that as a basis, for this question, let's say we have an ag parcel. It's zoned ag, but it's going to be under a conservation easement. We know that under the county's ag zoning, you can have a variety of different land uses, including residential and, agricultural products processing and sales, um, you know, side of the road, little kiosks where you can buy eggs, whatever. So does the new open space encompass all of those ideas? And, is the open space designation going to support zone districts like ag, like residential? Take some big residential subdivision from the 80s up in North Boulder that has a huge conservation easement on it. We've got 4 lots on 20 acres, and they're 4 1-acre building envelopes. And the rest of the 16 acres that's left over is in a conservation easement. That's going to look like OS on the comp plan map, right? But those are residentially zoned parcels. Those are zoned, low density residential. They're zoned residential estate, something like that. So does that OS land use map designation support all these other zone districts that could be applied?
It's a great question. And you're asking me a question that I would be better able to answer 6 months from now, I would say, because I think one of the great challenges and really the initial step, and I would say in particular related to this update to the comprehensive plan, because we are proposing a fairly substantive overhaul, particularly of the land use framework, we will need some time to develop those standards and practices to make the linkage and make the tie back between land use and then ultimately the zone districts, whether those be within the city or they're outside of our jurisdiction and they're relative to the county. I would say broadly speaking, the open space land use designation should not prevent anything because, again, particularly under the jurisdiction of the county, they'll use their own land use code. They will use their own zone districts and determination of what an allowed use is under that zoning. They will refer to and accommodate and interpret the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, but ultimately that zone district is what's going to lead with that. And I was looking at the current definition as we have it proposed for open space, and it does refer to.
Could you just read that? I was going to ask you to go to that
Yeah,
slide.
well, it's a little detailed. So within each land use designation, we've actually identified 3 different sort of descriptors. First of all, there's a description of what it is. So, good, clear understanding of, what are we talking about? Why it matters. So why does it matter to the community, to the larger vision for the valley? And then also, what can you expect? And I think this is what, really gets to your question, where under that what you can expect section describes, broadly speaking, the types of uses you can expect, both primary and supporting, the sort of urban design characteristics, and then also what does the mobility functions look like within that area. So under that urban design and management section, it does refer to structures such as trailheads, agricultural facilities, operational buildings, or small shelters are minimal, functional, and designed to blend into the natural setting. So it does reference that there will be some, or could be at least some level of construction, some level of development on those parcels, but it doesn't get into real specifics around it can be a residential use. It can only be 4,000 square feet, or it has an FAR of, it doesn't get into those really detailed technical and operational details.
So my fear is that if let's say you draw the definition in a sort of broad fashion, but you also don't allow for additional flexibility, and you say something like, open space land use map designation is meant to preserve open space values, conservation and related purposes, right? Some kind of typical planning language for what a land use map designation is for. Then the guy who's the tenant farmer at OSMP comes to us for a permit for a corn maze in June one year and says, on October 1st, I want to open this corn maze and run it for a month. And this is where, you're not being broad enough at the long range planning level can cause big problems in current planning when somebody comes to the current planner for a permit and they say, well, you've got a map designation of open space and that's meant to preserve and conserve, these open space values, and a corn maze doesn't fit. I'm going to deny that permit. So we know that farmers need to be able to do corn mazes in October sometimes to turn their red lines into black, right? And so that's where I'm just asking that, in those next 6 months, you take that into consideration.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good comment. Thanks.
Okay, I'm a layperson, so all of that complicated technical stuff that Harmon and my stuff is way more simple. But I say with OSO, good riddance. Hallelujah. Nice job. Thank goodness that is going to be a thing of the past. But I guess I'm still grappling with the OSA and the OSDR being compressed into one too, and also finding that confusing, like what I think of open space and all the restrictions that having that fee ownership or comes with it. And it just can be, maybe it's just going to take time for people to get used to it. It's going to take time for me to get used to it for sure. But there's a really big difference in my mind, and lumping them together just makes it, more confusing. And I guess I would also like to just understand the advantages of having the greenways land use designation, like because it can be open space, it can be, flood mitigation, it can be uh, under transportations management because it's a bike path. What does it, I know it's a system, but what does that designation really serve?
Yeah, I'll tackle the greenways question. Exactly what you just described in terms of the variety of the types of uses and the variety of management of those greenways. That's in part why we've actually identified that as a single land use designation. What we are attempting to do through this comp plan update is to, again, chart a course or a set a roadmap for how we might manage those systems differently in the future. And so by establishing that greenways as a land use designation under the systems class, we're essentially telling ourselves internally, we've got some work to do to clean house and to figure out how we're going to manage those greenways as important, values to the community and resources for the community. How are we going to manage those going forward? And so I can give you just a little sneak peek that, our utilities director has already reached out to our planning and development services director. And Dan, I don't know if he's looped you in on this, but, we're going to start to have some kind of quarterly coordination meetings amongst, the various departments that have influence or an interest in those greenways. So ideally, in the future, I think they can serve different purposes in different locations because certain portions of those greenways really do serve a more natural open space habitat type of service. Others, like the Goose Creek Greenway that flows through Boulder Junction, is very urban. It's flood management. There's a multi-use path. It's very transportation oriented. And in that context, maybe there is more of an interest for that to be more of a public space, more of a gathering space, more of an urban condition as opposed to something, that's much more natural. So I think the greenways are going to have different characteristics depending on where you find yourself within the city, but as a system, they are very important from a riparian perspective, from an environmental perspective, and then also some of these other sort of supportive systems in terms of transportation and our flood and stormwater management as well.
Anybody have anything more on greenways? Okay, my quick question on greenways is, if the greenways, again, sort of what zone districts do the greenways support? What's the underlying land use map designation support? If you got is it going to be, are we talking just public? Or are we talking just right away? If I have a property with, an easement across it for a trail, because I'm a farmer and we've purchased a little easement for a trail across my property, does that get a greenway land use map designation that runs through my agricultural map designation, and now I've kind of got split mapping on my parcel. How's that going to work?
Yeah, we've tried to be really intentional about where we applied those greenways to actually try to avoid some of the OSO issues that we've had in the past. And so there is a greenways network that's already identified through a plan that utilities has done. And so we use that as kind of a basis. It really follows mostly Boulder Creek and the tributaries. And so it wouldn't necessarily be applied to, trail alignments and things like that unless they happen to be associated with those tributaries and riparian areas. Most likely, I think this is going to be applicable to a lot of the land use designations. Is again, they provide a vision for the future, and then the underlying zoning is going to be much more specific about what can happen. As far as greenways is concerned, most of that area, a lot of that area is already city owned, quite honestly. And so I think there's going to be very few situations where that starts to cross over and have, serious impacts on a particular private property. But ultimately, if it happened to be a privately owned property within a residential neighborhood that maybe had a greenway running, behind it or something like that. Again, the land use designation is there to provide a future vision, but ultimately the zone district that would apply to that entire parcel is what's going to govern, what you could do on that site. And so there could be a consideration in a future development application that if there was going to be an expansion or a construction of a new house, we might look at that closely and say, well, do that outside of the greenway land use designation and, conform to that and use your site, in the other areas that are available to you. But ultimately, again, the zoning is going to guide exactly what you can do.
So my only just final feedback on that is there was another thing that was proposed and then you decided to let go of it, where you were going to not use a land use designation, but just use it as an overlay. And in some ways, just because of the linear style of greenways and what they really represent, I was wondering, would it make more sense to back it off and not make it an actual land use map designation, but just say, hey, this is an overlay?
Yeah, we considered that. We actually considered your comments from back in September that came from you about, sometimes overlays can be confused with zoning. And so partly why we did, double down and actually use that as a land use designation was to provide that level of clarity. We were concerned about having land use designations and then overlays. And at the time we were thinking about the OSDR and portions of OSO overlay. So then we were thinking, oh gosh, now we're getting into a situation where we have multiple overlays, multiple land use designations, and then there's zoning underneath all of that stuff. And so it also was I think a deliberate decision, again, to go back to this thinking of understanding how greenways are utilized within the community and how the services that they can provide to the community, which are numerous, and we want to make sure that we're establishing a really clear framework for staff and leadership to continue to work on that in the future.
Awesome, thank you. John, did you have anything a new direction for us to talk about?
No, I think y'all have nailed it. And like Michelle, I'm not super familiar with a lot of the land use topics, but I do, love the idea that we're getting rid of OSO. I've seen that cause a lot of community confusion in the past. And I'll echo also what Michelle said around, combining the OSA and the OSDR does seem like it could be confusing. I don't know if there's a way to fix that, right? But in theory, right, we could have a private residence on land that we have a conservation easement on, and on the map, someone's going to see that as that's open space land, right? And to the public or the community, that could be a little confusing, not having that differentiation. But yeah, I think it's probably fine.
So just going back to the confusion that Michelle's talking about, John's talking about, I'm personally not concerned about sticking OSA and OSDR into just an OS. The part that I'm concerned about is the definition of open space as a land use designation has to be broad enough so that those things that are confusing, like I've got this farm, it's zoned agricultural, I've got a house on it, and suddenly you just stuck me in an OS category, in an OS land use designation instead of an ag land use designation. I need to know that I'm still allowed to have a farm. So that definition of what open space is and making it broad enough to let all those things get thrown into the open space box is of utmost importance. Because when you had open space DR, it directed you to the conservation easement. It said, okay, this is open space DR. It's probably a farm. It's probably got a conservation easement. If you're not going to have that anymore, then the definition of open space has to be broad enough to let me have that.
Can I weigh in on this?
Said much better than I did.
Well, I'm going to put myself, as Michelle did, in the amateur kind of category. But I do think something's lost. And let's, every time we simplify something, we potentially lose nuance. And I think, the open space designation is for planning, but it's also a way of public communication. And you saw how much passion there was about the potential disposal of Hodges, which is a relatively small piece of the system. And I think for the public to be able to see what we own. So the open space fee or whatever, I guess the previously open space A, and what we manage through other means, given all the passion and the years that we've been taxing ourselves to buy these properties, and the idea that we could sell one off, keep some kind of a restriction on it and keep calling it open space, I think there's people who would have a problem with that. And at the very least, where there's a piece of information that's harder for the public to understand. And so I'm gonna just put it out there. I actually am, if you were to ask me today, I would say my preference would be to keep 2 designations, or at least make it clear what we own in fee and what is restricted. I think that serves the public. But again, I defer to the experts in terms of how that's implemented.
Okay, does anybody have any more questions or comments? Go ahead, Brady.
I got a few, but I'll just keep it to one. Okay.
This is we're only going to see these guys one more time.
Okay. The trail connections, were there controversies? I know, like the Erie connector, different agencies and bodies have different views on how that's implemented. And we haven't really talked about the trail connections. And so could you pull the curtain back a little bit? Was there any controversy? And in terms of how it shows up in those plans, is this just purely aspirational, saying, gee, wouldn't it be nice? Or is this more binding?
Yeah, so I might ask for Casey to add some clarity on that. She has more of a history on the trail connections in that discussion.
So Casey French, Planning and Design Senior Manager with Open Space and Mountain Parks.
Thank you.
When we were transferring what was in the previous trails map, we looked to a lot of those do have agreements. They were, we were put on. They have the big bubbles. We didn't. We transferred all the big bubbles and put them into arrows and named them. So a lot of them do have we didn't remove any. We were very careful on, hey, this, Boulder to Erie is there. We made the arrow. We just took away the bubbles because the bubbles kind of caused a little bit of confusion. In some cases, we had large bubbles. In many cases, we just had like a red arrow up to the top that pointed north, and only us planners who had followed iterations of the plan or had followed various council members even knew what the arrows were. Like if you go, those tiny little arrows are some of the ones that we made a lot larger because they were aspirational. It's that Joder to Heil. And so there was no place, it was just that tiny little red arrow up there. And so we thought we would make it a little bit more obvious as to what we were trying to connect to. And some of them do represent, I think, an agreed upon collaborative effort to pursue some of these. And then some of them truly are aspirational in the sense where they require acquisitions still. We don't have the means to implement them today. And some of them are closer to implementation. And I think that's why some of these stay on for 20, 30 years, because you first go to the acquisitions and then you get to the point where we can get together as agencies and collaborate on them. So they are in various stages. Does that help or answer the question about agreements? No.
Just curious if there was any controversy, if there's like arm wrestling going on.
No.
Mike.
I'm just, that's helpful. So they're aspirational, directional, Is there any arm wrestling going on between the city and the county on any of these, or
No,
is there
these are the
general
ones we've
agreement that
all
we
agreed
want these
upon.
things? We just don't totally know how it's going to happen yet.
Right.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, yeah, we had collaborative discussions with the county to determine which of these we agreed to bring forward into this graphic.
Okay.
So
We
that's,
might not agree like in exactly how we might want to do it. We haven't gotten to that point, but we all agree that we want to work together and plan for these.
And then I don't know if it was similar language in the current plan going to the draft plan, but we actually added a paragraph for how new ideas might emerge and how we want to build it into the BVCP discussion format in terms of raising potential things that both agencies would
Yeah.
like to talk about. Yeah.
I think a thing to bear in mind too is that this is a major update and there are other updates that occur on a relatively frequent basis. So this is a dynamic process of these aspirational trail connections, and this is something that can be updated in future renditions of the plan through that collaboration that's happening.
Just to be clear, I think it's great that they're on there and they're part of the plan. Okay, last question. Does the city have a policy on the use of AI in creating plans? And given how many plans we have, some of which haven't probably been looked at by more than 3 people over the last 20 years, to what extent do you use AI, or can you use AI under the city's policies to cross-reference all these plans and see where there are things that have changed names or things that are hanging out there or any inconsistencies?
The city does have an overarching broad policy on using AI, and I'm not going to be able to get it verbatim. I'm not the expert on that, but I think it is to verify the work. You can use it to help you analyze things, so we can use it if we wanted to cross-reference it in our in our daily work. But we have to make sure that we're verifying those results. It's not just like we're using AI to do it. And I think that's the gist of the policy. Please, if you know more, speak up if I got it wrong.
I can
Yeah.
say, I think that using a language model like that would be helpful to a limited extent. I still think it took us a lot of human brain power to dig and probe into these plans to see some of the legacy conversations that happened that actually don't all exist within plans, but exist within the documentation supporting the plan. So I just don't think we're there yet at that level of detail for AI to do that much good. The heavy lifting still has to come from staff and research.
Anything else? Michelle? Okay, I had probably exhausted most of my list. Maybe have a couple more questions. Let me take a look. And while I do that, or before I do that, actually, I see Sarah. Why don't we give Sarah a chance to weigh in if she wants to?
Yeah, thank you, Harmon. I may have missed it while I was in transition. Did we cover what changes are happening related to agricultural, the way we're describing agricultural lands, and or anything related to irrigation and water systems that are flowing through those ag lands?
Yeah, we looked at the different policies that reference ag and open space. So if you had any
Oh,
kind of
okay.
direct advice right now, you could just go ahead.
Without having heard that part, I don't. I will go and take a look at the YouTube video and catch myself up to speed. And if I have anything, I'll send it via email.
Okay, yeah, we didn't get too deep into it, Sarah, so I think just feel free to shoot written comments.
Okay, that sounds good. Unless there's anything that wasn't just that is worth saying to anybody there on the staff that's presenting right now. If there's anything that comes top of mind that you'd like to share in addition to what you'd already shared. Otherwise, I'll just watch the video and send free emails.
Okay, great, thank you. Thanks for tuning back in. So I would just start by saying, not only am I impressed that you took on OSO, but I really appreciate the way you did it. I think you really built a proper case for why it doesn't need to be continued as a land use map designation, and why all the open space values that OSO has purported to be there to protect are still protected through other means in our planning process and our approval process. So thanks for doing that. That's a really big win. Well, it'll be a big win. So one little sort of nitpick in the staff memo on page 11 of 31 of our PDF, in the Area 3 Planning Reserve definition, the last sentence says the service area is defined as Area 1 urban lands and Area 2 limited service. And I just want to know why'd you call it Area 2 limited service in that definition when Area 2 limited service doesn't exist as a definition above?
Yes, that's just that was a last minute terminology change. We changed area 2 to be called area 2 urban edge.
Okay.
So
you just
yeah.
have to square those
So
two
it's just
things.
it was just basically a typo in the memo.
Okay.
Yeah, but
Yeah, I was just
in the
wondering if
draft
I missed a new designation.
in the draft plan, area 2 is referred to as area 2 urban edge.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Yep.
So that'll be cleaned up.
Yep.
I just feel personally like I looked at all the ag policies. I'd love to see a policy language in one of the existing ag policies that talks about promoting or preserving the agricultural tradition or the agricultural heritage or both of Boulder County. I couldn't find any of that language, and I think Boulder County has a proud and long agricultural tradition of farming, in this county, in the city even, and I love the idea of highlighting that in the plan. And, you go back to my example of the farmer that wants to do a corn maze. If I'm that farmer, I'd love to see a policy that says you're supposed to preserve the agricultural heritage of this county. You have to let me have this corn maze. It's part of the agricultural heritage of this county. I'm highlighting my farming operation to kids who are going to be going through my corn maze and picking a pumpkin, and this is important stuff. And so I'd love to see that language specifically in one of the policies. And you got 5 or 6 ag policies that it would fit into if you wanted to. So that's my only specific sort of want. Yeah, and the rest we've handled. And I was going to offer to email you Elizabeth Black's and Paula Schuler's comments.
We have.
You've got them already. Cool. And I'm not picking out any particular language that they proposed that I think is Shakespeare, but there's a lot of good stuff in there. And as long as the email looks, it's actually the proposals in yellow are pretty succinct. So I just ask you to take a look at it because it's some good stuff. That's it for me. And if nobody else has any thoughts that came up because of what I said, then we can let you go and say thank you so much for a lot of hard work and really well presented.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
Thank you. All right, we got a little bit of a time to make up. So we're going to be moving into Madison Department, our second, which is
Dan, can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
Poor Alan Delamere, who tried so many times to get on, make public comment, actually came all the way to council chambers to make his public comment in person. Can we just reopen public comment for 3 minutes and let Alan speak?
I think that would be the discretion of the chair.
Okay, I'd like to do that.
Alan, you can come up to the mic if you would like to speak. We have some time set.
Alan, thanks for coming all the way to speak to us in person. We're going to open public comment right now for 3 minutes so you can make your comment to us.
Do you want me here or?
Right there. Yeah.
Okay, fine.
And say your name for the record.
Okay. Alan Delamere, 525 Mapleton Avenue, Boulder. I've been to many of your meetings over the years, and you caught me short because I've never been to a hybrid meeting. And I don't know why I couldn't communicate to you over the thing. It works fine for all my other Zooms, but not this one. So anyway, really the bottom line as far as I'm concerned is I'd like you all to take a walk with me around Red Rocks, because only when you do that are we going to be able to communicate, because I think we've got a disaster waiting to happen. And I think I'd very much like you all to be on the same page as I am and realize how serious this problem is. I've worked with Dan's people over the years. We went and looked at the problem at the bottom of the Senator's Alley, and we both held our hands in our head, and we said, hey, this is an enormous job, and nothing has been done in that area. Then, when you go around Red Looks, you find that even worse situation that exists. And that's why it's only when you have your feet on the ground and you look at it, can we then communicate with one another. And that, to me, is the bottom line for today. I mean, I've shared my many slides. I've got a pile of backups that I've added to it since. But basically, I think we, the community, are responsible for our open space. And we, the community, have got to get behind you people and support you in getting rid of this fire fuel. That's why I'm recommending, a pick up sticks day where everybody works together to try and get rid of the very severe problem that we've got ahead of us. So once again, pick a date, pick a time, and I will escort you around and we can talk on the right plane. Is that agreeable to you?
I don't know if I can speak for the board, but we'll talk to staff about the problem that you've identified.
So one board member is quite happy to join me. If the rest of them are, we can just do it any time that suits you.
We're not, I can say that I'm not exactly sure what the problem is. Are you saying there's a lot of fuel on the ground?
Well, I'm available almost any time, so we can do it either by ones or all four of you. And particularly, I'd like to go with Dan around there. And he's got some good people that are thinking about this. I've been working with Brian and Paul and of course Seth McKinney in the county. I mean, this is a serious problem, and we've got some serious professionals that we've got to support and make sure they can solve the problem.
Okay, thanks for letting us know, Alan. We'll look into it. Appreciate it.
Just thought I'd follow up. Next month,
Yeah.
we're going to be at the board, and we're going to have Paul here, and we're going to be talking fuels mitigation within the wildland urban interface, some of the overall strategies from a high level perspective, as well as some on the ground implementation for 2026. And we'll make sure we touch upon some of the areas that Alan's mentioning.
Awesome.
It
Thank
doesn't
you.
substitute for being out on the ground, but certainly that's one informational piece next month that we'll be diving into.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. Thank you, Alan. Thanks for coming.
Okay, now I think I sent my phone number to the open space board, so you can give me a call anytime and we can just take a quick stroll around. I think you'll suddenly be on my side.
Thank you.
Okay.
Love to.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate your
Thanks,
openness.
Alan.
Okay, public comment is now closed again. And I'll turn it back to Dan.
This is Hans Booker. Hans and I proposed the IR camera autonomous reception years ago, so we've been working on this a long time.
Okay, thank you.
Lisa, I'm here. You're here.
Let's go.
I don't even have to call you up. So Lisa Gonzalo, our Recreation Stewardship Senior Program Manager, is here to bring you sort of a culmination of an interest area that the board has had over the past year, and that's looking at some rule changes that could make some common sense to address a problem that a user group has been having. So to bring us to a culmination of that, I'm going to turn things over to Lisa.
Hi, board. Good to see you again. Thank you so much. So as Dan mentioned, we'll be here talking about updating the regulatory language to allow for precautionary landing on open space and mountain parks property. So part of our agenda today, we'll just have a brief overview of hang gliding and paragliding, as well as the designated launch and landing area at Wonderland Lake. Definitions around cross-country flight and what that looks like, the regulatory update itself, as well as next steps. Next slide. So paragliding and hang gliding on open space and mountain parks property, as well as parks and recreation property, dates back to 1975 and are both approved passive recreational activities in compliance with allowable uses in the Boulder Revised Code and City of Boulder Charter. Paragliding and hang gliding are both foot-launched, non-motorized forms of flight that operate silently. Paragliding uses a fabric wing with a harness, suspension lines, and brake toggles to control speed and direction, and weighs around 20 to 25 pounds. Hang gliders use a fixed wing made of aluminum alloy or a composite frame covered with a synthetic sailcloth and weighs around 45 to 80 pounds. Because of the weight, hang gliders commonly use a trailer and prefer to park relatively close to the launch site, hopefully within 200 feet, which our sites unfortunately are not able to accommodate. So it's uncommon to see a hang glider launch from open space property, though technically they are allowed. In contrast, I want to differentiate between these allowed uses and a paramotor, which is a gas-powered lightweight engine with a propeller that's very loud in flight. These are prohibited on open space, and that will continue to be the case. Next slide. So there are currently 4 dedicated launch sites in Boulder County, and they're located on OSMP property northwest of the Wonderland Lake Trail. The designated landing site is shown in purple here, and it is primarily located on Parks Recreation property at Foothills Community Park. This area provides a perfect grassy and gently sloping training hill for beginner and novice pilots, primarily P1s and P2s, to learn the mechanics of paragliding, including ground handling, where students learn how to control the wing. From launch to land, the ride takes about 4 minutes. P1s and P2s generally remain within this area as they build their skills. Next slide. More experienced pilots, P3s to P4s, learn to fly on rising air currents. This image on the left shows how migratory birds of prey use thermals to help them gain lift in the same process. Thermals are created by the sun heating the ground and the ground warming the air above it. As small plumes of warm air rise, they group together and form thermals. This happens more quickly in areas where there's a lot of surface heating, like the Flatirons, because they have a more direct angle to the sun than the ground. For this reason, the Front Range is regarded as a paraglider superhighway. Next slide. So the most common cross-country flight plans from the Wonderland Lake launch site, shown here in blue, are flying to Golden and then either driving back to Boulder with a group of pilots, or out to Golden and then back to Wonderland again. In 2025, 638 cross-country flights originating from Boulder were logged into the RMHPA voluntary system. 244 of these flights crossed the Flatirons. During the same time, only 8 citations were issued by rangers for landing outside of the designated landing zone, which is approximately 0.01% of all citations issued that year. Although the number is small, we recognize that the language needs to be strengthened to provide for pilot safety and to ensure they don't take any unnecessary risks. Next slide. Very specific weather conditions are required for cross-country flight, with optimal flying conditions occurring between March and October. It also requires knowledge of air law, flying regulations, aviation maps, and constant monitoring of wind speeds, cloud development, and barometric pressure. However, weather conditions often change and can be unpredictable. Even with the best pre-planning, a pilot can start to lose lift. If they're unable to find another thermal, they'll continue to descend. Unable to make it back to Wonderland Lake and left with no other options but to land, pilots then need to start looking for a safe location that's free of obstacles. Instead of landing on OSMP that's more wide open and often safer, pilots have frequently chosen to land in more dangerous locations to avoid receiving a citation. A citation for landing on OSMP outside of the designated landing zone requires a mandatory court appearance and can be time-consuming to contest, even if found not guilty through the process. Next slide. The current regulation, adopted in 2003, has an affirmative defense for a mid-air emergency as shown in number 1. An example of this could be equipment failure or a mid-air medical emergency such as a heart attack. In order to provide certainty for the gliding and paragliding community and for rangers enforcing the regulation, OSMP will update the regulation to specifically provide for precautionary landings that are consistent with the definition provided by the FAA. An example of the updated language is shown here in number 2, which reads, "It shall be a specific defense the landing of a hang glider or paraglider was as a result of precautionary landing when further flight was inadvisable or not possible due to, for example, deteriorating weather conditions." Next slide. To confirm this approach, OSMP staff spoke with Visitor Relations Manager Eric Kraus with Jefferson County Open Space. Jeffco has one of the only other designated launch zones on the Front Range and updated the recreation guide in 2024 to allow for precautionary landings. In speaking with Eric, he said the number of landings they have per year is so small, they felt that the most important thing to do was to provide for pilot safety. And that's part of the reason why they went ahead and improved and updated their language. They've also had only one instance of pilots landing illegally that was immediately recognized by staff. and alerted to RMHPA, who corrected the issue, and they haven't had any issues since. Next slide. So a couple of the recommended next steps, OSMP staff do not anticipate a change in pilot behavior due to the proposed updated regulation, such as a marked increase in landings that don't meet the definition of a precautionary landing. However, staff have coordinated with RMHPA to identify some management actions that can be taken to ensure a successful transition. Staff will amend the regulation and the MOU language to allow for precautionary landings. Staff will also extend the MOU for currently set to expire on April 29th for 1 year to monitor it. And if we see any issues, it will give us the opportunity to add any additional management language to help govern it. Staff will continue coordination as well with RMHPA and the rangers to ensure awareness of the change in rules. Next slide. Any questions?
Wow, thanks for that. We'll open it up to the board for questions. You want to get started with it, Brady?
Yeah, good. Couple comments and a question. Lisa, first of all, thank you for jumping on this. Appreciate that. I know you've been working with Vinay and others, which is great. And I just want to be clear that, you know, the deteriorating conditions, weather conditions, what I would, in my view, a less than satisfactory outcome from this would be if someone, if a ranger thinks deteriorating conditions means thunderstorms or something, and on a perfectly blue sky day, a pilot comes out of the sky and lands, and they say, well, that's not a precautionary landing. That's not deteriorating conditions. Well, the conditions that, as you mentioned, one of the tricky things about paragliding is the conditions that allow you to fly are completely invisible. The only hope you have is to see other pilots or a bird. And so the deteriorating condition is actually running out of lift. And so I would just encourage you to continue to work with Vinay and others to make sure that we're getting our law enforcement folks the direction they need, and that there will be times, and it's interesting you said, you know, there are only 8 citations. It's a testament to how infrequently they are landing on open space land, and hopefully that continues. But just make sure it's clear that, you know, running out of lift, not catching a thermal counts as a precautionary landing, unless, and this is where maybe I don't, you know, we'll understand maybe more over a year, unless somebody or the groups are clearly going for it when they shouldn't be, and then it becomes a habit. This should be very rare, but the thing that we're trying to make sure is that the pilots in the back of their mind aren't preparing to play cat and mouse with the rangers if they have to make a safety decision.
Exactly.
That's what we're trying to avoid. So that would be the only thing I would add, and just that Vinay and you, I know, are working really well together. And if I may bring one other issue, can you pull one of those photos up? There's another issue that I just want to bring it to everyone's attention. And it's an interesting analogy. So when we think about building trails, you know, in a sense, trails are for people, but trails are actually for the land in a lot of ways. You know, a trail minimizes impact and keeps people in one place. And this is, I believe this is Upper Launch. And this is not what Upper Launch looked like several years ago. And this is behaving very much like a trail. If you don't manage a trail, there's little rocks in the trail. It's very predictable what happens over time. Those rocks turn into bigger rocks because everything erodes and subsides. And before you know it, you've got a mess on your hands. This is happening on Upper Launch. And this isn't just inconvenient. If you can imagine laying out a nylon wing with little tiny lines, many of them, an overwhelming number of them when you're starting to learn, I can say. And then you wait for a little puff of wind and then you start running like hell. What happens when one of those lines catches on a rock or your wing catches on a rock? It can snap the line, cut it, it can damage the wing. And then you're suddenly under canopy, looking up, and part of your wing is flapping, or you've got a line that's broken. It's not good. This is going to degrade and continue to erode. It's not good for the landscape, and it's dangerous for pilots. And I think if we are saying that paragliding is an appropriate use of open space, in my view, as a former paraglider, not an active one anymore, this is not an appropriate launch. We can do better. And this is something that many land management agencies have managed. It requires the use of, geotextiles or something. I personally believe that we could do this in a way that does not create an eyesore. I mean, one of the great things about the paragliding community is they're basically invisible most of the time. And you look up on occasionally you'll see them all kind of with their wings out. But there isn't like when the paragliders aren't out, if you look up above Wonderland Lake, there's not this eyesore that just screams paragliding launch zone on you. I would really encourage the city to and open space to work with the paragliding community on geotextiles or other ways that we could manage this and just pretend this is just like a very special small section of trail. And if we don't manage it, it's going to get worse and it's going to be more dangerous. And that will require us to embrace technologies that we may not in other parts of the system. But I think it's the right thing. So thanks for the time to put that out there. And again, Lisa, thank you for working with the community. They say really good things about, the climbing community, the paragliding community. It's excellent.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, I just want to commend staff and you, Lisa, for working with this group of people to make this progress. And I know that they are really good stewards of the land too. They do a lot of volunteer work as well and take care of the land that they use. I also would agree that being able to put some surface there that makes it safer and actually protects the land is a good idea. But big kudos to you and this group for working together to make this happen.
Thank you. They make it really easy. They're a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Okay, so John's good. I'll just echo Michelle and Brady. I never heard of geotextile sort of launch strips that you can put down, but we put fishing platforms in lakes, and it's not completely out of the pale of what we do as land managers. So that's worth looking into. Awesome. And I think that the provisional nature of this, extending the MOU, looking at this new regulation, it's a great way to go forward. So I also think you're probably not going to run into a lot of issues that if I'm a paraglider, I'm not a paraglider, but if I was, I wouldn't want to be the guy who can't make it back to the landing zone. That would be a goal of mine. Let me make it back to the landing zone and follow the law. I think most people probably fall into that category, and that's why you deal with so few ranger issues with, or interactions between rangers and paragliders now. You probably will also have few issues in the future. So that's my take. Sticking to it, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. We've got one short item to conclude the meeting, and that's an informational item, is to continue to keep you updated on our work to improve and rehabilitate, in some cases, repair the whole Chautauqua trailhead area that OSMP manages. And Jeff Haley is joining us remotely to run us through a presentation. This will just be, we'll obviously be back to you as this continues to progress, but we thought enough has happened that it deserves an update for you all. And certainly if you have any feedback tonight, willing to hear that, but turn things over to Jeff Haley, Deputy Director.
Sorry, right before that, just while Lisa's still in the room and I see Sarah's still in the meeting, I never gave her an opportunity to comment on the last item.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, Sarah, did you have
Oh,
anything you
thank
wanted
you.
to say?
No, no, I am good. And if there's any more time for comment, I'll turn on my mic and let you know if there's anything that I want to say, so you don't have to worry that I'm not being called on.
Okay, yeah, I apologize for forgetting. So thank
That's
you for that.
okay. Thank you.
All right,
Okay.
back to you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening, trustees. Jeff Haley, Deputy Director for Visitor Experience and Infrastructure. I sincerely apologize, Michelle, for missing your final meeting here. It was a huge letdown for me. As you can tell, I'm battling a flu or something and trying to get well before spring break. And I certainly didn't want to get anybody else sick before spring break. So that's why I'm here this evening. But I just want to say thanks for all your service. And just one more gift from the staff is that, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, we completed all the bike rack installation across the system. So it was actually kind of a coincidental time frame there where the last
I guess there's one missing though.
Oh, better. I guess I can't say that, but yeah, we're substantially complete, I guess would be a good way to say that. But certainly appreciate all your support and thoughtful conversation over the years. So I'll just dive right in. Speaking of bike racks, we're continuing to work on the Chautauqua Ranger Cottage and Trailhead project. And tonight, as Dan mentioned, is a little bit of an inform and want to just kind of bring you all up to speed on where we're at. I think our last touch with the board formally was last year, roughly about this time when we did a written item updating the board on the process. And just by way of introduction or reminder, Chautauqua is a very special place, as we all know, and our current visitation there is estimated at about 741,000 annual visits. So it's definitely our most popular place. You're all very, very familiar with the types of visitors and who all visits there. And so that's put a strain on our resources and the site there that we want to address and just create a welcoming experience for, one of our kind of gems of the system. This evening we talked a lot about planning, and Chautauqua certainly has its fair share of planning over the years, dating back to 1937. Oddly enough, kind of looking at improvements and master plan in those areas. Most recently, we worked with the Colorado Chautauqua Association to develop a more innovative plan about sustainability and resilience. And so some of that work that's happening now with undergrounding utilities and other measures certainly are an outcome of that plan. But again, with all these plans, kind of like you were asking about AI, we want to make sure we're cross-referencing and including all these different outcomes and how we can implement some of those in this current trailhead area. And what the area is, I just want to remind it's just the trailhead and the cottage. So you're familiar with Bluebell Road, Kinnicknick Drive. So it really is just the OSMP area. We're not talking about the green or the auditorium or the dining hall or the cottages themselves. It's just our managed OSMP property, as you can see in this exhibit. And some of the improvements we're looking at pertain directly to this area. And again, our goals for this project, it really is as fancy and as exciting as it is. It's about public restrooms, almost first and foremost. We've had portable restrooms, portalettes over the years that have been needed to accommodate visitors. And we have a lot of infrastructure there that's just in disrepair, both in terms of its condition and then also not able to really satisfy the need or the amount of visitation that's there, which also includes kind of our circulation and wayfinding. We get a lot of visitors, I'll show here in just a moment, that are from outside the region, outside of Boulder, and a lot of times they don't quite know where to go or how to get to the services we have. And so what that looks like, what we've been up to is really developing a site program of, what do we want to address? What do we want to improve here at Chautauqua? We've been working with other agencies, both internal to the city as well as outside the city, looking at our cottage itself in terms of the needs there, transportation needs, really focused on accessibility. I'll describe that more in a moment, but how do we get our visitors, all visitors, to this place in a accessible manner? And so we've been looking at, the opportunities that other departments have and ideas and thoughts that our staff has who work there every day, as well as the operations, our trail crews, our trailhead crews, and that sort of thing. So I'll talk in a moment. A big part of this will be engaging our community. Just like tonight, we heard a robust community engagement, public comment. And so we want to hear from our community about the experience they have and how that can be kind of inform the project. So this is just a scattering of images, portalettes, crowded trailheads, different modes of access. We talked about multimodal. We have lime groves in the area. Electric bikes commonly come up to the area through tours. And so there's a variety going on. There's different infrastructure deficits. You can see the swale there that's crumbling, the stone swale in the parking area, and it goes on and on. And so where are we at in the process? Last time we talked to the board, we were going through some alternatives, and we've kind of refined those a bit. I'll show in just a moment. And then we're moving into the engagement portion so that we can hopefully identify a preferred alternative, or basically that final plan that will come back to the board later this year. So who's visiting and who's coming and going to Chautauqua? About 71% of our visitors arrive by vehicle, 28% arrive by human modes, biking, walking, running. We do have 42 bike rack spaces there at Chautauqua, and they have been utilized heavily, obviously. And during 88% of our observation periods from June to November, we've seen the lot is full. This is, we keep talking about human dimensions. This is some of the great example of some of the data they collect. Half of our visitors come from within the city limits, 11% live elsewhere in the county, and about 39% live outside Boulder County, and even 20% were visiting for the first time. So all that to say, as we know, we get a lot of folks from out of town, like I said, and we want to make sure we're letting those folks feel welcomed and accommodated and have a good experience, and that it's not just a locals destination, but truly a way that we can invite the region in to enjoy these wonderful places. Most people come to hike, enjoy nature, physical fitness, and those sorts of things. So we want to provide the services that really support those activities. And so what do those visitors do when they're here? Let me grab some water real quick. So it's a busy site, and you all have seen that obviously when you're there. People are trying to figure out where to go. There's a lot of decision making going on. Where can I park? The lot's full. Do I have to pay fees? Where's the bathroom? Where do I go for restrooms, drinking fountains, information, etc. And then there's a ton of trails as well. I mean, the meadow is full of different trails, different access points, and just parking throughout. So we're trying to use that, and we came up with these 3 different alternatives that we showed, that we developed in 24, and I believe we presented and described more in 25 last year. And so really 3 different alternatives. One of those was letter A. There was, in general, a very robust kind of redesign of the area, maximizing parking. Letter B was a more conventional parking area, but included a roundabout in the area for better circulation and buses and vehicles to get in and out of the area. And then letter C was a more traditional kind of minimal approach that kept the lot similar to how it is now. And so letter B, we have modified slightly. As you can see in the lower section there of letter B, exhibit B, plan B, whatever you want to call it, there's a new building that we've proposed just at the entrance. And so I'll talk about that more in just a moment. But through this analysis, these were kind of the key outcomes of the design and programming. I won't read through all these specifically, but you can see essential elements, kind of the things we really want to achieve, the items that really need to be improved. Excuse me. And then supporting elements that kind of support how we know that those elements will be successful. So if you think about restrooms, not only do we want to increase restrooms and eliminate these temporary, but all these supporting elements start to tell us about what are the hours that they're open? Can they be serviced? Are they very visible? Are they located? Those sorts of things. So we've taken those ideas and worked with our team to then work with others across the department and the community to look at other thoughts and feedback. Again, I won't go through this in great detail, but just to show the sheer magnitude of kind of design ideas and different items that have been included in the plan that we're trying to incorporate from all of our different peer departments, Parks and Rec, utilities, transportation, etc. One exciting thing I'd like to highlight this evening is how we've engaged our youth. I think the last time we were at the board of trustees, we talked about working with Growing Up Boulder. And so we wanted to also highlight in this presentation about the work we did last fall in September with 2 classes from Flatirons Elementary School here in town. And basically, it was a great opportunity to talk with those in our community that are 4th and 5th grade and have great ideas and fresh perspectives and a vision for how this place could be really cool, really exciting for the kids in town and visitors from across the country and the world. So this was a fun exercise. As you can see, the kids were given ideas and options that they could rank or tell us what they'd like to see and it took place right there at the cottage. So they got to have a sense of how this place functions now and how it could be better. So a lot of fun ideas that will be integrated into the final plan. And I want to highlight too, one of the most important elements I described earlier is accessibility. So as you all know, it's a steep climb up from baseline to Chautauqua. This exhibit just kind of shows that grade. It's basically an average grade of 9% from the cottage to baseline road, and about 45 feet of elevation change. So we're trying to figure out how we can reduce that or mitigate that a bit. And really what that means is how our visitors can have an accessible experience and having a welcoming experience for those that may have mobility needs and that sort of thing. So we've taken that into account as well. So just to show you where we're at, option B from the last time that I presented just a minute ago, that kind of showed that roundabout and introduced that new structure down to the north end or the lower area of Chautauqua. We've taken that as a kind of a staff preferred alternative and then expanded that a bit into these two options. We call it B1 and B2. Basically B1 would be, and I'm going through this quickly just because we're short on time tonight, but it'd basically be reconfiguring the parking area. You can see the numbers. We would create 60 spaces. We currently have 53 just in the trailhead lot. We would expand the existing cottage. So we would basically renovate the cottage, make it larger to support restrooms, gathering areas, exhibit space, and that sort of thing. And then we would create a new small restroom down to the north end, kind of right when you come in from baseline. And then build option B2 that you see on the right hand would basically keep the cottage the same size, same parking layout on both of them. But then the cottage would remain the same with just some minor interior renovations and turn it into more of a staff space where it's mainly offices and just kind of muster areas for staff, rangers, outreach staff, and that sort of thing. And then a new building would be built down to the north end, kind of at the lower end, to intercept a lot of visitors that come in from baseline that walk or hike, as we were showing in the visitation numbers earlier. So just a little more detail. When I talk about adding a restroom down at the bottom and expanding the cottage, it would look like one of our typical prefabricated restrooms you see here in the image. Without going through all these bullets, again, we would expand the cottage to include all those program elements we hope to achieve, provide that restroom down lower. So it would be a full, 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. usage for restrooms. We would have, multimodal bike racks, provide opportunities for bus drop off, a lot of different opportunities there. But the challenge with this one, it still doesn't quite achieve that accessibility issue because you would still have to come all the way up to the cottage to really interact with the folks there. Whereas option 2 then creates this new little, what I would call a visitor services building or a small visitor kiosk, and if you think about going to a national park and you see a small building with restrooms on one end and kind of an open door where you can get maps and information and, sunscreen or whatever the case might be, and basically interact with our team, our outreach staff. And there'd be a gathering area there for bus drop off, bike racks, and that sort of thing. And then certainly if you want to go up to the existing cottage, you can hike up the road and get there as well. So these are the two existing, and then the B1, B2, and I just highlighted in circles there, kind of the main differences. And I'd like to show just some 3D views. Excuse me. So if you're on baseline, the question might be, well, are you going to see this new building from the road? Is it going to block the Flatirons? And, how's that going to look? The reality is that building would be small, and just due to that grade change that I described and kind of the location, it would not interfere with the view shed. You can see here when you're on baseline turning into Kinnikinnick there, the Flatirons view is kind of uninterrupted. Everything from Bluebell Road, to the west. And then you can see a couple different images. So the neighbors across the street, it wouldn't really come into their view, just due to all the vegetation and the grade changes. And we'll show more detailed 3D views, but then On the far right hand, that's also coming in Kinnicknick. Your eye is drawn. In fact, it's a historic view to the dining hall. And that's what that shows in that image. And that, again, that new building, if we were to consider that, would not impede the view of when you come in and really see the grandeur of the green lawn, the dining hall, and all the historic elements. Again, some 3D views, just aerial 3D. Obviously, B1, you can see that enlarged, much larger visitor or ranger cottage that achieves everything up there in its current location, and then a small little bathroom just down at the north end there. But you can see how that new parking area would lay in there. And then similarly, B2, again, cottages, the existing cottage, same size. And you kind of see how that new building would be tucked into. Basically, right now, there's a small little stormwater detention area, and we would use that to provide this new structure and just kind of a gathering space. A couple other views looking east. Again, just more or less pulling everything down towards baseline to intercept our visitors, both, obviously if they're parked in the parking lot or coming, a lot of folks come from baseline and then they use the shuttle or bikes or what have you. And then lastly, kind of a view like what it would look like with the Flatirons in the background. Again, these are just quick 3D sketches to kind of give a sense of scale and location. So what's next? What are we thinking? We want to continue the concept plan and get to that preferred alternative. We're going to do more cost estimating. I didn't mention earlier, but we have done some conceptual cost estimating. And as some of you probably know, in the construction industry, oddly enough, or unfortunately, sometimes it's cheaper to build a new building than it is to renovate existing. The cottage itself, existing, was basically built like a single family residential structure. It's pretty small, small rooms. And so our consultants have said, it's going to be, you can kind of renovate, but it's going to be pretty much kind of a rebuild. We'll get down to the structure, but we'll have to build on some structural elements and that sort of thing. So that's kind of what's led to us thinking about a new building, or I guess I should say a complementary building. Instead of one large new or renovated ranger cottage, we would have kind of two smaller buildings that staff can use between the two. But we're going to keep working on that, looking at cost, making sure we're within our project budget. And then we're going to start talking with the community, engaging our community. It was great to talk with the kids, the students, and then we anticipate similar outreach to our community this summer with some open house style opportunities at the cottage. We'll certainly do some online engagement as well, like we always do through social media and webpage and newsletters and that sort of thing. Basically give folks a chance to see these plans, see some of the ideas we have, give their thoughts, let us know if we've missed anything, and just give thoughts and feedback that we'll consider in the final design. Again, this isn't a public collaboration. It's not that we're asking the community to design this with us. It's more, give us your thoughts and feedback that we can take into consideration as we move forward. And we'd like to come back to the board this fall, certainly, and kind of show you some updated plans, what we've heard from our community, and want to hear from you all as well. So in other words, you'll have time to give us feedback before we kind of, put a check mark on that preferred alternative. We'd love for you all to have the input from the community kind of top of mind and know what they're saying, as well as the kids. It was pretty good stuff before you make any decisions or give us any final feedback. And really, our goal is to get to preliminary design, hopefully maybe even later this year and early next year. Nothing would be constructed or start implementing until 27 at the earliest. With Sundance coming up and other things, we don't want to start making a mess up there before we get a bunch of visitors in town and that sort of thing. So we want to time that. And as you know, there's a lot of city projects going on. In fact, I didn't mention that earlier, but that's one of the really goals or opportunities, I should say, with this project is we're doing paving. You've probably seen a lot of the work with the utilities and the swales and work on the auditorium, et cetera. So we want to partner with our other departments and save money if we can in terms of construction costs. So all that to say, like Dan mentioned, this is more of an informed, just a quick kind of update. However, if you have any thoughts and feedback, I know it's late, but feel free to kind of chime in on any of these kind of prompts. Or again, please know that we'll be back. Certainly we'll invite you all to the outreach when we do the little pop-ups at the cottage this summer. it'd be great to have you all kind of participate and see how it goes, and then certainly be back in the fall to get all your ideas too. So again, thanks for listening to my horrible coughing and all that tonight, and thanks for your support.
Jeff, thanks for toughing it out. Hope you feel better soon.
Yeah.
And thanks for the presentation. I'm going to give it to Michelle. She's got a question.
Okay.
Yeah, Jeff, I really like the new ideas that you're coming up with. I was surprised to see them, but I really like that you're thinking so creatively about that space. And having served on the Chautauqua board, I know how difficult it is to do things out there because of just the old buildings. So totally get that. Also wanted to thank you for staying home tonight.
Yeah.
You sound terrible. No, but nobody here wants that.
I know.
So thank you for doing that. And you know, I've had actually I've worked with Jeff for 3 boards now. So I think at
Yeah.
the tail end of my Parks and Rec term, and then when I was on Chautauqua, he was doing a road show about a bathroom.
Yeah,
About
that's
a
right.
toilet.
More bathrooms.
But he likes to talk about toilets.
Mhm.
And then we're talking about it again tonight. So I don't know what's next for me, but hopefully I know that there'll be a feature with you talking about bathrooms. So thank you.
All right. Looking forward to it.
I like the fact that Jeff can make fun of you about bike racks and you can throw it right back to him about toilets.
That's right. I expect John to get me a Yeti mug with a bathroom on it. So
don't retire. Give him any reason to, though. All right, John, do you
that's
have any?
right.
No, that was great, Jeff. Please get some rest for me.
Oh, okay. Thanks, John.
Okay. Brady, any thoughts? Okay. Well, Jeff, I think seems like the board understands the importance of the project. I believe that the plans support the goals. I hope they'll meet the visitor needs. We got a lot of visitors up there, and do support the community engagement approach. I have so thanks for that.
Mhm.
Could you throw up the slide with the preferred alternative, sort of that's living now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just, I noticed in B1 and B2, the parking that's against the green, that easternmost row of parking, has been reduced from 15 to 6 cars. I'm wondering if you might want to consider another option, which would be to shift Connect over into that parking lane
Mm.
and then make room in the eastern of those 2 parking courts for a second row of parking. So you take the parking completely off of the green, which I think would make Connect a lot safer, because you wouldn't have people trying to figure out how to get into a 90-degree spot and holding up traffic that's coming in from baseline. And instead of only getting 6 spots, you might get a whole other row within the parking area if you've
Mhm.
got the room. So you could get 20 more spots along a new eastern row of parking within the parking area. You'd also have you wouldn't have such a sharp turn. That right that you have to make as you're going up the hill, where
Yeah.
there's the elbow where you hit the green and it's a T intersection. That would smooth that turning movement out. So I
Yeah.
think, you'd end up with a safer street, more parking spots, and then the green wouldn't, when you're looking across the green, you wouldn't see a whole bunch of headlights and stuff and
Mhm.
bumpers. You just have a curb line at the end of the green with no cars, or maybe just a sidewalk, and I think it would maybe be nicer.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I appreciate that comment. That's and Harmon or others, I encourage. I can send along this presentation to the board, and if you all wanted to start looking at these plans and think of ideas or any feedback, but that's a great one. The thing with the green gets a little tricky, as
The
Michelle
historic
probably knows.
piece.
Yeah, it's kind
Yeah,
of the
I
historic,
thought of that.
and the green is somewhat of the sacred ground.
A sacred
But
ground with 15 crappy parking spots on it.
well,
That's the argument.
exactly. It's kind of like over the years, it's just developed into this.
Yeah.
Let's throw some parking. So I think that if we had a more comprehensive green without any parking on its edges or border, or just along that south side there along the dining hall. But yeah, that's something we can look at and see if that alignment would work.
Yeah, if you could get the space for, you need the 24 feet between the 2 rows of parking if you're going to make a double-sided parking court there. But hopefully you'd have the room. That would be really cool. And
Yeah.
just get the parking off the green right there. Because I bring my kids over there for camp and stuff, and the spots are convenient, but they're ugly.
Oh,
and
yeah.
There's just they don't help the green at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it really, you get a lot of visitors that come from the green over to the trailhead and vice versa. And it kind of creates a safety issue too, where you have people just kind of pop out between the cars
Yeah.
into the, and so they would reduce that where you'd have a lot better visibility too, just for that,
Yeah.
Pedestrians moving back and forth.
Yeah. Another good point. Okay. Any other thoughts? Okay. Jeff, thank you. Please, tea, sleep, vitamin C.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm getting better. It sounds
Really?
bad. Yeah.
All
All
right.
right. Thanks, everyone.
Quick thumbs up vote. Everybody wants to hear Dan's presentation after 9 o'clock,
Oh.
right? Hey, yes.
Go
ahead.
I just want to defend myself as a director of this organization that we did not demand that Jeff show up tonight. In fact, we gave him a complete out, and he really wanted to stick to it and stick to the plan. I don't know if he regrets that decision, but wanted to let you know that we are compassionate over here in open space, and he did not have to do this tonight. But I'm feeling terrible that he even attempted. So, and I have no director updates.
Okay. Well, then thank you very much, Dan, and thanks to everybody. Another great meeting. And Michelle's last.